Great. Good afternoon and welcome back to docket number 210515 REO1, Bureau's investigation into revenue adjustment mechanisms for a performance-based regulation framework. We are here for our 12th technical meeting in this reopener, and we do have an agenda in front of us today, which is a slight departure from the roundtable format that we have been using for the past couple of technical meetings. We have some presentations on the agenda today. I will turn it over to Bureau's Director of the Office of Technical and Regulatory Analysis, which is a well-deserved promotion for Mr. Kramer. So we'll turn it over to Director Kramer to continue, please.
Thank you, Chair Gillette. Good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so we're going to get into our roundtable discussion for Tech Meeting 12 as the chairman suggested. And as she mentioned, my name is Peter Kramer with Authority Staff, and I'll start by laying out the plan for the meeting today. Our objectives are first to dive deeper into the subject of the total factor productivity study and benchmarking study, which can inform the selection of a productivity factor or an X factor and a stretch or an S factor within the proposed I-X revenue cap formula for performance-based regulation. So that's our first objective, to dig deeper into this topic. And then secondarily, certainly we're aiming to and allow for some more open dialogue here among participants sitting in the room together. Develop these ideas as we can. So that's our objectives today. In terms of our housekeeping items, this is a live broadcast. This meeting is being broadcast on Bureau's YouTube channel, and the recording of the live stream can be found there after the meeting. We're also joined by a court reporter today. Thank you. And the transcript of the meeting will be posted when it's available. For our discussion, please make sure that you speak into the microphones in front of you and ensure that they're on with the green button, or the green light rather. That way, both in-person and remote attendees can hear all of our representatives. And speaking of which, sitting up here at the tables are roundtable representatives, our identified representatives from docket participants and other stakeholders. And as indicated in our tech meeting notice, these are the main participants in the roundtable discussion today. Other representatives in attendance may confer with these identified representatives and may be recognized to speak as relevant to the discussion and as time allows. That includes both conferring with folks in the audience, and also representatives or members of the audience may approach the podium if they'd like to be recognized to speak and contribute to the discussion as well. In doing so, if you just state your name and affiliation at the podium, and then we'll find a time to recognize you to speak. We do have a break scheduled following our presentations and Q&A. And that will take place at approximately 2:15. We'll keep that a little flexible just depending on how the presentations and the Q&A goes. And excuse me, for our format today, we do, as I mentioned, have these two topics to cover: the total factor productivity study, the benchmarking study. And we'll begin with presentations from Eversource and from UI regarding these topics. And each presentation will be followed by a question and answer period where Authority staff and participants may ask questions of the presenters. And after the break, we'll continue the discussion on our two topics, and staff for each topic will provide just a brief introduction relative to the straw proposal, and then we'll move into further question and discussion from there. So with that as our plan for the meeting today, let's begin with introductions. And I'll ask everyone to please state their name and affiliation for the record. And I'll start, Mr. Hurwitz, with you, and we'll work our way around the room, please.
Jacob Hurwitz, here today on behalf of UI.
Mark Lowry, President of Pacific Economics Group.
Albert Zablowski, OCC staff.
Tom Wheel, Office of Consumer Counsel also.
Doug Horton with Eversource.
Julia Freyer with London Economics International.
Jay Goodman with the law firm of Couch White, LLP, appearing on behalf of the Connecticut Industrial Energy Consumers, or CIEC.
Great, and thank you all for being here. With that, let's begin with our first presentation. So our representatives from Eversource, Mr. Horton and Ms. Freyer, I believe Ms. Lupley is getting your slides up on the screen as we watch. Thank you, Ms. Lupley. Okay. Mr. Horton and Ms. Freyer, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank
Oh,
you.
and
everyone.
I'm sorry, false start. I apologies. We have on the agenda about 30 minutes for both the presentation and the Q&A time. So if you can keep that in mind so that we have some time to follow up with questions from the group.
Of course.
Thank you.
And in fact, I was going to suggest in the spirit of a discussion around table, if there's any questions at any point, we don't need to finish the slides. It might as well be worth listening to the questions and having that discussion. So what we tried to do was address some of the questions that were in the notice for this workshop and specifically keep it quite short and high level, but with some hopefully examples that we can talk about as the key points come out. There's only 6 substantive slides, so if we can go to the next slide. Basically, again, the topic is industry TFP studies and benchmarking studies. And what we want to cover in those 6 slides is the different techniques. When we say an industry TFP study, what do we mean by industry? What's the scope of that as it relates to PBR here in Connecticut for electric distribution utilities? And then also cover, importantly, the time frame of those studies and the data. These are analytical tools. So data is at the heart of all of this, making sure that we're using good quality data that then is reliable enough to make good quality insights and findings for purposes of rate making. So with kind of the what I call kind of my TFP 101 that we've used with other regulators around the world when we're doing this type of presentation, I think it's important to think about what kind of methodologies and techniques are being used, and importantly, what are the outputs of those studies so that you know ahead of doing all that work how you would apply those outputs or results. So with an industry TFP study, what we're trying to capture, the magic words is the change in total factor productivity, that's the acronym TFP, for an industry over time, in order that we can then use it to calibrate a very important parameter of the revenue adjustment mechanism, calibrate the X factor. The reason it's called total factor productivity is because it is going to cover all inputs, total inputs that go into that are used by utilities in the case of this proceeding, electric distribution utilities, to serve their customers. And in terms of outputs, what we're trying to capture is, well, how much service are they providing? I'm trying to be very specific in thinking about and using words like inputs or how much, because the basic premise behind a total factor productivity is that we're looking at quantities. How many inputs does a utility need to bring to bear in the industry to then be able to provide service to its customers? Again, quantity of inputs, quantity measurements of the service being provided, which it's very common in our industry to use customers, and I'll get into that in a bit. And we need to also look at it over time because, of course, a trend by definition, also known as a growth rate, could only be measured if we're looking over a period of time, not at a single point of time. And for this industry, because there are lumpy capital investments made over time, because there are also the possibility of one-off impacts that may affect certain measurements of output. For example, weather that may affect the megawatt hours of service delivered through the distribution grid. For these reasons and a variety of others, it's very important to capture a sufficiently long time frame that is going to cover a period of time where you could properly measure the total factor productivity. And in fact, in the top chart of this slide, what we have is an example of the components of total factor productivity. There's a blue and a green line. I know it's kind of hard to see on the screens, but hopefully in your version online. There's also a red dotted line and of course a black line. So we have different components that go into the total factor productivity indices that measure that trend over time. And it's some of these components are much more volatile than others, but importantly, we're not trying to capture one single year. We're looking at the average trend over time. On the other flip end, but quite related, is a benchmarking study. A benchmarking study, commonly in this industry, would be looking to evaluate different utilities or firms against each other, rather than looking at the industry as a whole. And typically what we're trying to estimate is a particular metric. So in the case again of applicability or purpose of a benchmarking study for rate making purposes, it's very common to see benchmarking studies report out total costs per customer or total costs per megawatt hour delivered on the network. And think about how those costs vary between firms. And vary against, for example, an average that represents all firms in the industry, in the relevant industry. A benchmarking study in that regard could be used to learn more about relative productivity or relative cost levels per unit of output at a given point in time. So instead of being over time, like a TFP study, a benchmarking study typically is designed to focus at a particular point in time, although it may still use multiple years of data in order to smooth out some of the anomalies that happen to affect any particular utility. Total cost could vary, or megawatt hour served could vary from one year to the next. But you don't want to look at a very long period of time. You want to focus on most likely the most recent point of time. If we go on to the next slide, we talk a little bit here about the techniques. This is not something that is new to this group of stakeholders, because the table on various techniques to implement a total factor productivity has been presented, I think, in written comments, as well as in, I think, papers that the OCC has provided to PURA as part of their comments and other documents. Generally speaking, to do a total factor productivity study, there are two broad categories of techniques. Both are very numbers or data intensive to some degree. One technique, which we'll call an index method technique, is a numerical technique, whereas another set of techniques are typically using other methodologies like linear programming or statistics, econometrics. Each set of techniques has its advantages and disadvantages, shortcomings as well as strengths, if you will, for application. In North America, it's very common, most common, to see the index method used for producing total factor productivity studies in a variety of sectors, not just electric distribution. And the reason why we see it so commonly used is because it is much more transparent. It is easy to understand. You don't need to have a statistics degree or a mathematics degree to implement linear programming. You can just follow the data, if you will, the data breadcrumbs through a database, an Excel spreadsheet. That's all it takes. You don't need to, sometimes we can make things fancy, but you can, you can break it back to the basics, where we've typically done these models generally in Excel so that they're accessible to anyone. The other, I would say, advantage of index methods is that they tend to require less data than other techniques, and are less sensitive to outliers. Because again, in an industry TFP study, you're aggregating all the components. Whereas when you do statistics or linear programming, although the intent is to aggregate components, you are still leveraging methodologies that may look at individual data points. And so just by a virtue of statistics, when you have anomalies and you try to do an average, the average is influenced by that anomaly. It will be less influenced, less influential with an index method. So the data needs of data envelope analysis or stochastic frontier analysis, those other more complex methodologies is more is higher, and there may be some issues where you start to have outliers influence outcomes and cause some stability problems. On the flip side, because we want to be objective, there are also shortcomings of index methods. One of the shortcomings that we as practitioners always feel most likely to raise is that we can't decompose the total factor productivity trends when using the index method. We can't tell the regulator or the utility what is driving the total factor productivity. Is it economies of scale? Is it technological change in the industry? Is it some other factor that may be driving those TFP trends? Depending on data availability, and depending on how you implement the study with a stochastic frontier analysis or a DA analysis, you may be able to decompose that. You may be able to answer those questions. So again, as practitioners, we always love to answer questions. So sometimes it's we like to implement those techniques, but I would say based on my experience, they are more commonly implemented in an academic setting where we can discuss those things and think about it, not in a regulatory setting, because again, the results sometimes tend to be quite sensitive to the data inputs and not stable. So if we go to the next slide, and as I mentioned before, the purpose of doing a TFP study for X factor setting, it really needs to be done in the context of the industry. And in the US, we've got currently, I think, 166 utilities, investor-owned utilities. So this isn't even counting publicly owned utilities or distribution co-ops that may be providing service. That is a lot of utilities. However, many of those utilities are very, very small. So we don't necessarily need our industry TFP study to cover all 166 entities in the US, but we need to cover, I would say, the majority that provide service and the ones that are relevant to the utilities that you are hoping to use this type of analysis to support regulatory or rate-making principles. Generally speaking, in our experience, we've aimed for at least 50 to 60 utilities, generally because most of the utilities we work with regulators to regulate tend to be mid to larger size, so we don't have to worry about the very, very small utilities that have 10,000 customers. The other thing I had mentioned, again, a TFP study has to cover a period of time. So one of the complexities, and I'll keep coming back to this, of doing a TFP study is that you need to have the data for all the utilities you intend to study over a long period of time. And that tends to be the practical limitation on implementation, that sometimes there are utilities that weren't even potentially FERC jurisdictional, so hadn't provided information in the same way that other peers had, because we typically use FERC Form 1 data to try to collect all this information for distribution utilities around the US. That being said, I think the United States, from my experience, has got one of the best data sets in the world for this type of analysis. We've worked in Europe, we've worked in Australia, in New Zealand, and Canada as well. And we've had a variety of data issues in those other jurisdictions, and I think we've generally been able to overcome them in the United States much better and much quicker. Yes, please.
Thanks. Jay Goodman for CIEC. Just to elaborate on that, you said if you're doing a study in the United States relying on the FERC Form 1 data, how complete does your data set tend to be? I mean, if you're using 50 utilities in your group, do you tend to have a relatively complete set of data for all the, I guess, factors or inputs you want in, or how big are the data gaps, I guess really is the question.
Usually we're pretty sticklers. So if a particular utility is missing, let's say a couple of years of data, and or a particular parameter, and maybe we can go to slide 6 if I can ask, because it has a list of some of the data that you need, just so we're looking at it. For example, let's say that you've decided again there are a couple of choices along this process of doing the analysis, but you've decided you wanted to do a monetary approach for measuring capital as an input. And of course, capital is a critical input. You couldn't do a total factor productivity study without considering it. And some of the utilities you have don't have data going back to the 80s or 90s for a variety of reasons. You would have to exclude those utilities as being part of the industry. So for the minimum 50 to 60 utilities that we would have complete data. Maybe there's 1 year, one data point that's missing and we can interpolate. But generally, if there's multiple data points or multiple years of missing data, we probably can't interpolate very well. So it's an exclusionary criteria. But again, from my experience in the US, for electric distribution utilities, as well as other types of utilities in the energy space, we really do have very good data. So, and again, that data needs to go back many years over time. And in some instances, with respect to capital, it might actually have to go back decades before even the start date of your study. So if you decide you want to do a TFP trend, let's say over 10 years, latest available data is 2022/2023 right now. And if you want to go back 10 years, let's say you would have to go back to 2013, 2014, but you would need decades more before that of data for capital in order to implement the techniques correctly. Again, though, despite this sounding very significant in terms of the data collection process, and I can't stress the amount of work that does need to go in and clean the data and check it, it is doable in the US for electric distribution utilities. Since we're on this slide, maybe I'll spend a few minutes here. There are definitely a lot of choices you make as a practitioner, but I think there is, on many of these, a large consensus on the most reasonable set of choices that you would make when you design the structure of the study. For example, total factor productivity, you want to measure all costs or all inputs. Of course, you're going to capture capital and non-capital costs. There's a lot of different types of costs and non-capital costs, like labor costs, material costs, and of course, all that level of detail may not be reported consistently across utilities, so you might not be able to get all those parameters, but you will be able to get, at the minimum, aggregated to capital versus non-capital. So there are some decision points that you could make subject to data, but generally speaking, they're very intuitive and logical. You want to capture this. What's the data showing you about how to best capture this information? There's also a lot of elements even on the output side you can capture too or decide on. It's very common in our industry to see number of customers being used as a proxy for the quantity or the how much of service being provided by utilities. You could also look at annual energy delivery amounts, basically megawatt hours of electricity delivered. That's an option. We've seen studies where we've used peak demand as well, the system carrying capacity of the distribution systems. That is not as readily available in the US, but it is an option that I just wanted you to be aware of that's out there. And I could probably spend a lot more time talking about all these features, but I wanted to maybe hit one more topic before I move over to benchmarking, and that's on slide 5.
Just one more,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt again. One more question. I think this will be pretty brief, but on that slide where you're showing different inputs and different outputs, I think I missed the basic point of whether the study would include all those inputs or as many of them as you have data for and all the outputs, or is the study typically more focused on a subset?
Great question, actually. So thank you. I was trying to fit into 15 minutes and skipping around a bit. In completing a total factor productivity study, you want to focus on all inputs, but sometimes you can't disaggregate them. So for example, I mentioned that you will want to study capital and non-capital uses by the utilities to produce their service. It's pretty clear that we can, and we will have data to segregate out capital versus non-capital, but even non-capital you can break down further, and sometimes we're not able to break it down further, but doesn't mean that we haven't captured all the inputs though. On outputs, it's much more traditional to see a single output model rather than studying all of these outputs simultaneously in one TFP. So there's a choice to be made. And you could run different sensitivities where you try out different outputs. The data, again, is readily available and collectible quite quickly. I guess you could say, subject to data, you can set up the analysis to cover lots of different dimensions that describe the services that the utility is providing. Going back to maybe quickly slide 5 before I move on to benchmarking. Again, I think because I keep coming back to the time frame of the TFP study, I think it's that time frame has 2 elements to it. You want to capture a time frame that is, as I mentioned already, sufficiently in length that you're capturing the investment cycle, or at least the majority of an investment cycle, rather than just a couple of years. But you also don't want to go too long. It's the Goldilocks effect, I think of it, of not too large, not too small. You don't want it to go out too many years into the historically back, because then you may be capturing a different set of constraints on the utility, different technologies that the utilities might have used 20, 30 years ago, different policies that may have been affecting how they provided service to their customers. So you have to have kind of a very practical balance that you put in there. And of course, talking about practical stuff, data will be another constraint, because you really can't go back quite easily and do 30, 40-year studies for this sector, because you would need 70, 80 years of capital data, which just might not be available on a consistent basis. So most likely it'll be a 10 to 20-year study.
Ms. Freyre, on that point, is there a rule of thumb about sort of the multiplier between the term that you're looking to study and then how further back you would need to go for capital data?
Another great question. The technical answer to this, it depends a little bit on the methodology and assumptions you're making with how you're measuring capital. So if you're measuring capital using what I call the monetary approach, and then depending on the depreciation, physical depreciation profile you want to use with that capital. And that really is more of an engineering question. What kind of capital do the utilities use? How does it physically deteriorate over time? Does it deteriorate over time very quickly, like electronics components, or like a car you take off of a new lot when you just bought it? It drops very quickly. That's an example of a particular depreciation profile. And I'm talking now about the car's monetary value. We're looking at physical depreciation. We'll need to think about a depreciation profile, and depending on the choice made on that depreciation profile, you may need a little bit more data, a little bit less data. But again, generally speaking, we try to go back at least another 10 years, maybe another 20 to 30 years. And it depends again on the technical life of the assets, the capital that the utility is using. So there is an engineering element to it.
Hi, Tom Wheel from OCC. I have a couple of questions before you about to move on to the benchmark.
Benchmarking, yes.
Yeah. My first question, in developing the TFP study, when you're choosing the 50 to 60 firms, is it similar to picking proxy groups in a cost of capital analysis where there's some sort of criteria that's chosen to determine like what's in and what's out?
I think if we go back to slide 4, that might be a good one to have behind us as we're talking about it. We try to, I think when you think about picking proxy groups for cost of capital study, they're much smaller. We're not talking 50, 60 utilities usually from my experience doing those. So what we're trying to do is develop a data set that represents the industry, subject to availability of the data itself. So the bigger, the better. But as you can imagine, there's in the bar graph, you see a lot of little tiny bars, probably, I think over half of those tiny bars are probably less than 1 million customers, probably significantly less than 1 million customers. They may not be contributing because of their size too much to the industry, and therefore the total factor productivity. So as a practical rule, we may not need to capture all those.
Okay, and is that a subjective choice when you do the study? Like if you look at the data set and you say maybe it doesn't make sense to include firms with less than 1 million customers or less than 1.2 million customers, or like at some point you draw a line, right? When is that?
So the way we like to do it is actually we let the data draw the line. Maybe it's a little bit of a impractical aspect of me being kind of a data analyst at heart. I like all of the data I can get. And then we look at the quality of the data and that draws itself where we're missing. And usually it's the smaller firms that have had a harder time to upkeep their data filings, either with their state regulator or with FERC. We just start to lose out on having a consistent data set for that firm.
Okay. I had a general question about on slide 3, I guess. The TFP index, I see like the equation, just want to make sure I understand. Is that basically you take the data set that you've determined and you calculate all the deltas between outputs and inputs? But is that something that you just, I guess the broader question is this whole process conducted every time there's a TFP study, or is there sort of like a consensus index that's used across multiple TFP studies?
Not for, I would say that different consultants want to do their own TFP study. Maybe that's the best way to do it. But there are inputs to this TFP study. For example, we do need to deflate O&M costs in order to convert those into units or quantities of O&M being expended by the industry to provide service. And the deflators generally are, for us, we go to BLS, like deflators. There's a labor index, labor compensation index we commonly use. There are other indices for kind of general materials and services purchased by firms. We also need a deflator for capital as well to make sure that we're measuring real capital stock rather than looking at financial metrics like CapEx or total asset base, which they're an input to the process, but they're not the end game when we're thinking about quantity of capital being deployed. So there are some common indices that everybody uses, but I suspect that when we create the index and the weights that we use, I guess once you get your hands a little bit dirty with the actual spreadsheets, you'll see that it's actually a calculation process from the industry financial data.
Thanks. I have like 4 more questions, but in the interest of time, I'll narrow it down to one. When you're counting capital, when capital is used as an input, is that CapEx at the time that that the CapEx is expended or when the associated investment enters service, or does it have some timing have to do with when it actually starts depreciating? Does it depend on what you're trying to measure?
So I'm going to try to use words because I don't think I created a slide that had the full formula. When we think about capital input quantity, what we're trying to look at is the change over time, year to year, in the capital stock, the real, and then we deflate it. So it's the real capital stock.
The rate base in our terminology?
It starts with, it includes consideration of rate base, but it also includes consideration of capital expenditures. It also includes consideration of retirements. So it goes through that whole process. And on top of that, depreciation, physical depreciation or deterioration of the assets that have been put into service. So all of that is part of the formula. I wish I could just put up an equation here or have a whiteboard to draw it out. But all of those pieces have to be considered. In terms of CapEx and retirements, it's those that are reported on the FERC Form 1 accounts. So I think that gives you an answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there more you'd like to present, Ms. Frey, or is it a good time to go to some Q&A?
Q&A, I had one slide on benchmarking, but it's
Please.
good.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
All I would say on benchmarking, and there was already a lot of text in the slide that was probably self-explanatory, is that there's a little bit of a subtle difference. Again, there's multiple types of techniques that could be done for benchmarking. You could do a benchmarking analysis that entirely uses data from the index-based TFP study. And what it simply then does is the index TFP study had aggregated the data across firms into an industry number. When you move to a benchmarking that relies on index-based ratios, you disaggregate it back to the individual firms and you just do a comparison of the total costs per customer or some other evaluatory metric that you want to look at to benchmark. And then there are more, I think, again, more complex techniques, perhaps, that allow you to go even one step further and better understand if there are external drivers that are affecting these relative cost indicators. For example, economies of scale for firms, their location, the legacy of how their network was evolved over time, the density of their network and how that impacts costs. All those other factors can be taken into consideration if you move away from just an index-based method to more of a statistical or econometric method. But again, the idea here is you're no longer looking at all the firms in the aggregate, but you're comparing, let's say, firms again relative to each other. So you could see which firms have the highest costs per customer, which firms have the lowest. And that could be used as one of the inputs to think about things like stretch factors. I know that when we think about the X factor in the TFP, it's a very linear process. You do the TFP, you then decide on what the inflation factor is and make adjustments if you need to, depending on the choice of inflation factor, and that gets you to an X factor. And the theory underpinning all that, the fact that we're mimicking competition by using inflation and this X factor kind of supports that process. With benchmarking, although it's analytical, I don't think there's a straight line process as much where you start with a benchmarking study and a direct output of that benchmarking study immediately gives you that stretch factor. But it can help inform that. So it can help also inform other aspects of rate making. For example, it can help with other information, inform discussions about the trajectory or the of relative costs of one firm to the industry average or to the top tier of its peers and so forth. And I'll stop here because I think that's probably gives you a feel for it and see if there's any questions.
Thank you. I'll start just with a couple that are on my mind. And the first being, Ms. Freyer, when we were talking about selecting utilities for the peer group, I am curious the extent to which the regulatory environment in terms of it being, the utilities being in a deregulated environment versus a vertically integrated environment, the extent to which that informs selection of utilities in any way for the peer group and the sort of costs that are accounted for.
It doesn't, because we know that with FERC Form 1, the way that the costs are reported is consistent regardless of the regulatory or the structure. So the way that we gather information on distribution costs, we don't have to make any accommodation or adjustment. If we were in a different country and there was a problem getting distribution costs, if it was a vertically integrated utility, yes, that would probably limit us. Again, the practicality of the data. But otherwise, there is no accommodation or like inclusion or exclusion rules around that.
Okay, thank you. Somewhat relatedly, I'm curious the extent to which weather is accounted for in any way, or why it would not be included in the analysis. Similarly, the extent to which, again, looking at different peer utilities, the policy goals might influence the nature of costs or the trends over time for some utilities. So are those accounted for in any way in the analysis? And if not, why not?
And let me actually step back even to my last answer when you asked me about the business structure of the utilities and this most recent question, you're asking about it in the context of a TFP study, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm getting confused because I have the benchmarking slide in front of me. And my answer might differ for a benchmarking study, but
Okay.
for purposes of a TFP study, what we're trying to really grapple with is it's almost a hypothetical that we're creating to support the cornerstones of how we're designing PBR. The hypothetical is, let's assume this was a competitive industry where distribution utilities were competing against each other. A distribution utility would need to keep up with the latest technology and the processes that its competitors are implementing in order to be able to continue to attract customers to its service. Because if it wasn't able to keep up, then it would price itself out of, basically no longer be competitive. That's the heart, in my own words, of what an I-X represents when we apply the economic theory, in that we're allowing the base rates to rise with what we believe is the physical productivity trend for the industry as a whole, not for specific subsets of the industry, plus whatever is inflationary pressure that's exogenous. Again, no single firm in a competitive industry can influence inflation, right? So we're giving it the benefit of allowing its cost to move with inflation, but also taking into account that productivity, the trend in productivity, the process. So for that reason, we don't want to, we want to capture the industry. We don't want to try to create smaller peer groups that say, we're only going to look at other utilities that are small like us or large like us, or we'll only look at utilities in the industry that are in the same weather zone as us. Because what we're actually trying to say is that there is a broader, perhaps national, maybe regional, if you could if you think there are strict regional differences, but there's an industry and there's a pool of competitors in an industry, and I want to motivate the regulated utility to keep up with the industry.
Mm-hmm. So is it, in other words, is it safe to say that the study assumes that some of those other influences like weather or policy do not influence a utility's productivity?
They may influence a utility's productivity depending on how you measure it. For example, weather typically won't impact number of customers as their output, but it would impact annual megawatt hour sales potentially.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't write off that it doesn't influence the productivity process. But I think what you are saying is the utility has to deal with those.
Mhm.
And dealing with those is captured in the productivity. And maybe the utility doesn't deal with it in the same degree that its competitors, but in order to stay aligned with its competitors, and again, I'm making that analogy. We know that it's not a competitive industry, but to kind of continue on that hypothetical analogy, it needs to be able to keep pace with the industry trends and productivity.
I see. Thank you. We are on our agenda to go to our presentation from our colleagues at UI next. If others do have would maybe take just one more question for this presentation, and then we can move on and adjust our schedule accordingly. I'm going to ask you, Mr. Hurwitz, because you haven't had a chance to ask a question yet, if there's something you'd like to, please.
Just one as a follow-up to that last line of questioning. Is it fair, Ms. Frere, to think about, as Attorney Wheel has noted, I'm big on things hanging together and the flow through effects of one thing on something else. Is it fair to think of some of the criteria Mr. Kramer was just asking about as potentially addressed through the benchmarking study? If you have a large peer group through the total factor productivity study intended to measure the utility industry as a whole, that you could then account for some of those utility-specific considerations in the benchmarking analysis?
Yes, because the point of the benchmarking study is to be able to tease out relative costs or costs per unit per output metric. And in that case, there may be those exogenous drivers, policy drivers, or other factors that are present that have an impact on total costs, and you want to take account of those, or at least isolate them from what is otherwise driving performance.
All right, thank you. And Attorney Goodman, we will have time in our discussion after the break to come back to all of these topics, really. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to you, Ms. Frere, and invite our colleagues, Mr. Lowry and Mr. Hurwitz, for their presentation from UI, please.
Just a few introductory remarks, and then I'll hand the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Lowry. Thank you, Pura and Pura staff, for the opportunity to continue contributing to the record in this proceeding, and also congratulations, Director Kramer, on the promotion. We see a TFP study or X factor study and the companion benchmarking study as necessary to the success of PBR for a couple of reasons. First, to ensure that the resulting rates are reflective of utility costs. And you skip on to one more slide, please. Thank you. So we see a TFP study or X factor study and the companion benchmarking study as necessary to the success of PBR to ensure that the resulting rates are reflective of utility costs. It appears to UI that basically every party who's commented so far in this proceeding has agreed that utility rates should allow the utility an opportunity, but not a guarantee, to recover its costs and earn a fair rate of return on and of capital invested for the public use. And as some participants to this proceeding have expressed, and as my colleague Mark will explain further in a minute, there's a difference between the economy as a whole and the utility industry specifically. And for the I factor, everyone seems to be coalescing around the use of GDPPI, which is an economy-wide measure. Accordingly, for everything to hang together, theoretically, there must be an additional adjustment to account for those differences. And the second reason is to ensure that rates are set in a well-evidenced and principled manner. I understand that TFP is complicated, but that's not a reason to just not do the study. To help folks get their arms around what exactly these studies involve, we've provided through Discovery some examples of what other utilities have filed when conducting studies of these nature, so that OCC, Pura staff, or CIC, or anyone else may have an opportunity to review and start to get comfortable. And then, my last comment before handing the microphone over is, we don't know, obviously, with 100% certainty what other regulators thought when evaluating the considerations in setting an X factor or S factor, but based on what they've written, it appears to us that those two factors I just mentioned, the importance of getting rates right and the importance of setting rates in a well-evidenced and principled manner, are the factors that have caused regulators in other jurisdictions to rely on TFP and benchmarking studies. And we've quoted a couple of those here in Massachusetts in the Alberta Utilities Commission. So with that, we hand it over.
Thank you. I know you're all have had some familiarity with Julia Fryer, but I might just give a little bit about my background in the area. I've been doing studies of productivity and benchmarking since the late 1980s. I was the expert witness in the first uses of index-based rate making in Massachusetts and Maine, Vermont, also Hawaii, where I've worked several times for the Hawaiian electric companies. I've also been very active in Canadian PBR, where benchmarking and productivity studies have been used in all 4 of the populous provinces of Canada, and I've been active in all of those. So I'm going to try to complement what Julie has done today by giving more of a 30,000-foot view of what is important in getting ready to commission an X factor study. Because I haven't been closely involved in the proceeding up till now, but I have been kind of monitoring it every so often. And I felt that at times there was maybe a need for a little reinforcement of some basic principles. So that's what I'm going to focus on today and not the gory details. So I'd like to start by basic consideration of basic cost theory. When you open up economics textbook, you'll immediately find that cost is a function of operating scale and input prices. What the textbook won't say is that cost is also a function of a lot of other basic external business conditions. An example I like to use in power distribution is the degree of forestation in the service territory, which not only differs around the country at a point in time, but it evolves over time. In Connecticut, for example, it's always to more forestation instead of less. So if cost is a function of input prices and operating scale, then there's a classic paper from the 1980s that shows that the growth in cost is equal to the growth in input prices plus the growth in operating scale and minus the growth in productivity. And that is the basis for a revenue cap index formula, such as I understand you want in Connecticut. So a standard revenue cap index formula would say the growth in revenue is equal to inflation minus an X factor and a stretch factor plus the growth in operating scale. And usually in a study for a power distributor, that will be done by the growth in the number of customers served. In the United States also, it's very, very common to use the gross domestic price index as the inflation measure. And this goes back to telecommunications regulation before this type of stuff ever got started in the utility industry. The GDPPI is the growth in the inflation in the final goods of the U.S. economy, which include consumer goods and capital equipment and exports. So some people here might be surprised that I put the number of customers served as a standard component of a revenue cap index. There are actually many precedents for that, and I've listed some of them here. But think also that around the country, a lot of people don't have revenue cap indexes, but they do have revenue decoupling. And usually a revenue decoupling mechanism is combined with something called a revenue adjustment mechanism that automatically escalates revenue between rate cases. And the escalator that's almost always used in those cases is the number of customers served. So some of you may stick to your guns then and say, well, I'm sure I've seen revenue cap indexes that don't have a customer growth term. And let me explain to you why that is. And that is that oftentimes when utilities are confronted with a regulator that wants a revenue cap index, they will assert, usually with reason, that they are going to need more revenue than the revenue cap index yields. And in particular, they want supplemental capital revenue. And so on the assumption that they are going to get supplemental capital revenue by some means, they will then not insist on having a customer growth term in the formula. So that's why there's a little bit of uncertainty about this. But in terms of the basic principles, there should be a customer growth term. And if there isn't one, basically that becomes an implicit stretch factor that needs to be considered when the topic rolls around to the appropriate stretch factor. Could go to the next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So now you all know, and because you've heard this a lot of times now, that an X factor is usually based on a productivity study that's basically looking at an industry multi-factor productivity trend. That's really the proper word. Sometimes they'll call that a total factor productivity trend. Now, I'll disagree with Ms. Fryer a bit in that trend is frequently not the trend of the industry. It is often the trend of the region surrounding the utility. I would think if you looked at all of the X factor studies ever done in New England, that they oftentimes have looked at a Northeast or New England utility productivity trend. Now, why might that be? Well, there have been studies done that decompose the sources of total factor productivity growth. And some of those drivers are things that you would associate with the notion of cost efficiency, things like a change in the technology of the industry, or the realization of economies of scale, or something called X inefficiency, which is the distance of an individual utilities from these hypothetical cost efficiency frontier, because all utilities are a little bit away from that frontier, if not a lot of ways. But remember, I said earlier that cost is a function of numerous external business conditions as well. I mentioned forestation, but some other important ones in this day and age include system age. That is to say, the number of assets that are approaching replacement age. There is also changes in undergrounding and resiliency standards, such as may be required here in Connecticut. So the bottom line is that productivity is not a perfect measure of cost efficiency growth. It should not even be deemed to be synonymous with cost efficiency, because it is also reflective of these changes in other external business conditions. Not only that those other external business conditions can actually drive productivity growth negative without the industry actually suffering from a worsening of their cost efficiency. Again, this would be for reasons beyond their control. Now, this is actually less of a thing in the power distribution industry than it is in the gas utility industry here in the northeastern United States. A lot of utilities have for many years had cast iron and unprotected bare steel mains that, according to federal government policy that's spearheaded by PHMSA, they're required to replace on an accelerated basis. And when they do that, it is going to drive their productivity growth negative for reasons beyond their control. And indeed, the productivity growth trend of Northeast gas distributors is materially negative for this reason. Next slide, please. And I guess I should go back. You don't have to change the slide, but another punchline from what I was just saying is that's the reason why regional productivity peer groups can make sense, because maybe they better reflect the trends in some of these external business conditions like advancing system age that can have an impact on productivity growth of the subject utility. All right, now we get to the third complication, which is that the gross domestic product price index is an output price index. It's a measure of output price trends in the economy. And so why would it be a good measure of the input prices of utilities? Well, one thing that matters there is the productivity growth of the U.S. economy. On my equation 2 here, it says that the growth of GDP-PI is the difference between the growth in the input prices of the U.S. economy and the growth in the productivity of the economy. That wouldn't matter if the growth of the productivity of the economy was slow, like it is in Canada, for example. But actually, our economy has some of the most rapid productivity growth in the world. The multi-factor productivity growth of the US economy over 15-year periods is usually something like 0.7 or 0.9%. So that really makes for that really means that the GDP PI is not a very good measure of the input price trend of the economy. And then there's the issue of, well, why would it then be used to apply to utilities? Well, if you take the first and the second equation that I've noted here and you put them together, you have another theoretical result that the growth in cost is equal to GDP PI inflation, growth in scale minus growth in productivity, but then also an additional term that I call the inflation differential, the difference between the industry input price growth and the GDP PI. Now, this isn't a formula you usually see, and I'll explain why in a moment. But my point here is that if you make that could provide the basis for a separate adjustment in a revenue cap index that has nothing to do with cost efficiency. And then the regulator does not stand accused of being soft about the issue of productivity growth targets, because there's no inherent need to put this into the X factor at all. Then the point is that you need to consider input price trends in X factor studies. I mean, you have to be mindful of the input price trends anyways in order to measure the input quantity growth of the industry. And again, that this input inflation differential could be a separate term in a revenue cap index. Going to the next slide then. Now, some of you have visited Massachusetts over the years, and you know that there are a lot of famous universities up there, and there are even PhD people walking around on the streets of Boston. And so they found a way to do this in a more complicated way than is necessary. The revenue cap indexes that are used in Massachusetts rate making are going to combine my relations 2 and 3 to get a result that you have seen in some of the other presentations. So now we have a new sort of conceptual formula underlying the revenue cap index. Growth in cost has got the GDP PI term. It has the scale growth term. But now it has what they call a productivity differential, the difference between the productivity growth of the industry and the economy. And then also the growth in the input prices of the economy minus the growth in the input prices of the industry. And in Massachusetts, that is how they define an X factor. They use the productivity differential and the input price differential. And let me say this about the input price differential, and that is a very complicated and controversial issue over which experts can and have agreed over time. And so it potentially becomes an issue in an X factor study. So what comes out of this then is that the X factors have been quite negative in Massachusetts because they include that GDP PI correction. It's not like they're soft about productivity growth targets. It's that they swept all this together into one number that could easily be negative because of mainly because of the rapid productivity growth of the US economy. Now, interestingly, some legislators in Massachusetts got wind of the fact that the BPU was approving these negative X factors, and they started to complain that this doesn't look good, this doesn't have curb appeal for Massachusetts customers. And so they started to back away from the use of these big negative X factors in Massachusetts. And the main way they did that was to agree to give the utilities substantial supplemental capital revenue so that they weren't as insistent on having the negative X factors. And since then, there have been, you haven't seen the negative X factors used as frequently there. Now, some of you may still say, well, I remember that there's this a zero X factor in Hawaii. Well, I've been involved in 3 generations of PBR in Hawaii, so I can tell you a little story about how that happened. First of all, in the second of the 3 Hawaiian PBR proceedings, they had to decide on an X factor. And there was no evidence from X factor witnesses in that proceeding about what the number should be. And so it was agreed to set the number at 0. Now, in the more recent proceeding, the one that's gotten all the attention, there were 2 X factor witnesses. One was myself, and the other was a witness for an environmental group called Blue Planet. And they both were based on US in my case, it was cost trend data and productivity stuff. And in Blue Planet's case, he used an alternative revenue approach. But they both agreed to the same thing, which is that the X factor should be a negative. And yet the commission disregarded that evidence. And one of the big reasons that they did that was that they said, well, that's something that happened on the mainland. And here we are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. How do we know that a phenomenon of, say, the sluggishness of the GDPPI is applicable to Hawaii just because it's applicable on the mainland? So try to remember that when you think about that aspect of Hawaiian rate making. When you add all the nice PIMs and the revenue decoupling and a 0 X factor in that proceeding, you can see why a lot of people here in the US got excited about Hawaiian rate making. But that was one aspect of the commission's decision that, in my opinion, was not very wise. Going to the next slide. Yeah, I'm almost
Just
done.
to, okay, just to check on time
Yeah,
that,
this is my last slide.
thank you.
Then there'll be time for questions. So in this last of my slides, what I've tried to do is to compile the latest available inflation data that is applicable to the New England states. And what you see here on one slide is, first of all, the GDPPI, which is in the sort of purple dots. And then you see 3 measures of New England relevant input price inflation. And one of these is the employment cost index for salaries and wages of the New England states that's compiled by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Another one is some index that Jacob has mentioned on a number of occasions, which is the Handy Whitman Index of power distribution construction costs in the North Atlantic region. That's the closest to New England. And then finally is a number, an index that I have developed called Power Distribution Material and Service Price Index. There is Standard & Poor's, if you have $30,000 in your pocket, has an index of power distribution material and service input price trends. But based on my research, it's really just a measure of materials price trends. It doesn't really take account of services, which is the biggest chunk of materials and services for most utilities today. And of course, these services are very labor intensive. So when you adjust for that inaccuracy, you find that this yellowish line is also growing faster than the GDPPI. And if it was just that Standard & Poor's index, I can tell you that it tracks the GDPPI closely until about the last 3 years, and then it also is rising more rapidly. So in my opinion, what this all shows is that when you're thinking of a study to help you calibrate the X factor, it really shouldn't even be called a productivity study because it's really a productivity and input price study. And in fact, in my opinion, the input price part of that study is more important than the productivity piece because there isn't that much disagreement between experts about the productivity growth. There's more disagreement about how you would measure the input price correction. And you could say then, well, why not just have an industry-specific input price index? You certainly could, but then it's just as complicated to agree on that as it would be to agree on the input price correction because it still requires the calculation of the industry input price index.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Lowry. And we have a few minutes for some questions. I can get started. You anticipated and responded to two of my questions during the presentation, so thank you for that. I did have one question on the slide that we were just on, and looking at it. It wasn't evident to me that the green dashed line was the Handy Whitman, which we have discussed in this proceeding a couple of times. But knowing that, my curiosity is the same, because I don't think we've gotten, or it would be helpful to if we have already, to have it stated in the record again. If you could speak just briefly about the core drivers between the difference in those construction costs in the Handy Whitman being so different from what we see in the GDPPI line, please.
Yeah, well, the Handy Whitman, for one thing, is sensitive to the prices of metals that are used in power distribution, construction power distribution facilities. And, those metals include steel and copper and aluminum. It also is sensitive to labor prices. In this case, labor price trends in the Northeast. And I believe that surge that you've seen in the last couple of years is probably also reflective of a bit of a slowdown in the construction of distribution facilities, a lot of which is replacement CapEx in the aftermath of the pandemic. And just in general, you have to remember when you're talking CapEx in power distribution, very little of it is yet about CapEx, capital expansion, capacity expansion. It's about replacement CapEx.
Thank you. Did others have questions for Mr. Lowry?
I just had one, Tom Wheel from OCC again. Just curious, on a similar note, it sounds like it might be appropriate to consider using various different inputs for the I factor then, to consider using something like the Handy Whitman index. Are there similar, I guess maybe feeding off of what I was just asking Ms. Freyer, are there similar standardized indices that might make sense to consider for the X factor?
For the whole X factor, you mean, not sure what you mean. Of course, the X factor, again, it's also a matter of whether you want to have that rolled in Massachusetts style X factor. But I think that it's desirable to have an update of existing recent studies of productivity trends, because we're just coming out of the pandemic and results during the pandemic years could be skewed. I think, for example, that with if at a minimum 2023 is included, you're going to see some uptick in productivity for that year. I want to also say, I don't want to put the fear of God in anyone about the construction cost index, which looks like a runaway train, but that's not actually the index you would use in an X factor study or even in a utility specific index, because that's basically the price associated with CapEx, whereas what you really want is the price, the construction cost that's implicit in the rate base. And so that's a much smoother type of trend. It's still rising, but it's not a runaway train like this is.
Thanks. And you just mentioned existing recent studies of productivity trends. Do you mean are there productivity trend studies external to the utility industry that are useful to look at? And if so, where would we find those?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by external to the utility industry. I guess it can be noted that most X factor witnesses are utility witnesses almost exclusively. I'm an exception to that rule. I have a very balanced practice with regulators and a number of consumer advocates. For example, I'm the longtime advisor on PBR to the Ontario Energy Board and have been involved in many proceedings on their behalf. So for example, I have a study that was done last year on productivity of US utilities, but I think it's in need of, first of all, it's in need of an update to 2023. It's not considering the propriety of a New England or Northeast peer group. And then there's this whole matter of the inflation differential, which doesn't really exist in Canada because they do use sort of crude multi-price averages. They work a labor price index into the formula, but also the multi-factor productivity trend of the Canadian economy is kind of zero. So this issue doesn't actually come up there like it does in the United States.
Okay, so you meant, I think, that in developing a TFP study, like in a particular rate case, in developing that study, consideration should be made for other recent studies in other jurisdictions. Is that what you mean?
Well, you can always look at those. I would say that Massachusetts is not a one-stop shopping for that. The studies done there, particularly on the benchmarking side, are not always first rate. And also, frankly, the commission has a tendency to always agree with the utility. So it kind of that has to be borne in mind as well.
Thanks.
This, one other question that came to me through your discussion with Attorney Wheel is going to slide 7 and the point that I think you're making around the approach in Massachusetts with the combination of productivity differential and input price differential. Is it the case then, sort of tying that concept to the graph on the following slide 8, I think it is, that the input price differential point that you're making about separating that out, would that be represented by the difference between, for example, GDPPI in the purple dashed line and power distribution material and service price index in the orange dashed line?
No, because really if you were even going to use the stuff in the figure, that would be more like the inflation differential on the preceding slide. If you're going to the input price differential in a Massachusetts style X factor, that's a more complicated issue because you have to have the input price trend of the US economy, and that's not pictured here. That would be a lot more rapid. In fact, I've often thought, although I've never seen it approved, that if you just had GDPPI plus the multi-factor productivity growth of the industry, that's not a bad approach. Just to add that term to, so that you effectively have your own ORA estimate of the input price trend of the economy.
Interesting. Okay. I think that's all that I have for the moment. Any further questions before we take a moment to, Attorney Goodman, please.
Thank you. Question, in the beginning, I think you made a comment about looking at more regional trends rather than national economy-wide productivity. And just following off of that, I'm trying to understand how the study can or even should account for more granular distinctions between utilities in different jurisdictions. 2 examples come to mind. One, for example, New York last year passed a law, actually I think early this year, saying that for certain work conducted by the utilities, they have to pay what's called prevailing wage, which is basically tying the cost to a union labor rate. And that was a significant driver for one component of cost for the utilities. Mr. Hurwitz's nodding his head, he might be familiar with what happened in New York. Another example could be, you just made the comment that in Massachusetts, the regulator tends to agree with utilities, and you seem kind of critical of that, which maybe I'm reading too much into it, but suggests that there could be commission tendencies like that could drive costs one way or another, or if there was a law or policy in the state that said all distribution has to be undergrounded, for example, that again would impact costs. How are these things accounted for in the total, in the productivity study? Because it seems like they could be material drivers of cost differences between the utilities, but I don't see how they aren't just washed out if you're looking at a very large group of utilities.
Well, when I said what I said about Massachusetts, it was only about the X factor, and in particular, this matter of the input price differential, that's a very complicated issue, and they've tended to side with to have decided with the utility on how that would be calculated. I don't think that has effect on their cost trend.
Okay.
Now, you mentioned something in New York. Well, yes, I mean, you could look at just about every state and find that there's a little something different about them compared to Connecticut. And so, you know, there's a limit to how much you want to anguish about those small differences. But many times in a New England or Northeast productivity peer group has been approved as sort of, well, yeah, at least in this part of the country, we'd expect the trends to be more similar to our home utilities trend. I mean, and the gas would be the perfect example. I mean, you wouldn't, if you were to have indexing for the gas distributors here, which you really could because the data is almost better than it is for electric, you would want to use a New England trend because insofar as they still have cast iron and bare steel to replace. So just a question of how complicated. I hadn't heard the one about New York. It's interesting.
And I understand your point that, sorry if I just follow up quickly, that there are going to be many differences from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I guess the concern is that it seems possible that you could have a utility, I mean, for example, UI just based on the whatever collection of circumstances there may be, could have a better cost structure, or could be situated in a way that might be very favorable compared to the regional trend. And I don't think I understand the fundamentals to articulate this correctly, so hopefully I can make the question understandable. But I guess the concern is if you use even a regional study for productivity, if there's a way that if you were to look instead at the utilities' actual costs, what their opportunities are to be more productive, if you will, and operate more efficiently, that there might be some way where they could fall into a scenario where there's actually, they don't have to do much different in order to appear like they actually are operating a lot more efficiently relative to other utilities in the study group, and whether that could drive, I don't mean as pejorative as come out, but like a windfall in revenues for the utility.
Well, don't forget that there is the stretch factor term too, which is linked to a benchmarking study. So that can also adjust the overall difficulty of or challenge of the revenue cap index for UI. I mean, I'm not here today to convince everyone that you should use a X factor based on a regional trend, but what I am here to emphasize is that that's the kind of issue that will be in your study, or should be in your study, along with due appraisal of this inflation issue.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Lowry, thank you for the presentation and for answering the questions. And with that, let's take I would say about 10-minute break. We'll come back at 2:35, please. So 10 minutes, and we'll get into some more discussion on both of these topics. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the presentations. I think we can go back on the record and continue with the agenda, please.
Thank you. Okay, Ms. Lupoli, could you take us to our next slide? And we can skip past this one. Thank you. So with the presentations as some foregrounding for the discussion, we would like to spend some more time getting into more of the particulars and having an open forum here for participants to ask questions of one another as well. To tee up our first topic, we're going to start with the total factor productivity study. And the description that's on the screen here is cited to a study by a report by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory on TFP studies and some best practices related to those studies. And as noted here on the screen as well, a TFP study was not contemplated, not recommended as part of the straw proposal. And so therefore there's not additional, or I'm sorry, there is additional discovery that has been conducted on it since the straw proposal to bring more into the record in terms of what it could look like and the uses, the value of conducting such. So the next slide does include a laundry list of the discovery to date, including technical meetings where we've discussed it, but more recently interrogatories looking for specific information on the TFP studies. And we'll get started with some questions from authority staff and go from there. And following this discussion, we'll move on to the benchmarking study. So Mr. White, would you like to get us started, please?
Thank you. So the first point that I'll make is my questions are going to start with the TFP study, but I also realize that there's some overlap with the benchmarking study. So I have no problem with that, speak freely, but just try to be clear in case they are overlapping or totally segregated. Thank you. So starting with some methodology, question for OCC. The Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, PNNL, has described two general TFP methodologies. And actually, so part of this is getting on the same page with regard to terminology. So Laura, if you could advance 2 slides, I think, from there. So I took a small matrix. Is that clear? Or am I? Oh, all right. I took this from the PNNL study just so that we have common terminology. According to PNNL, non-frontier tends to be less complicated and commonly used in North American PBR. What is OCC's view on methodology choices, your current view? And I say that also partly in the context of, I know we had touched on this in August, just a few months ago. So I do recall your comments then, but I just wanted to touch base more in relation to this, having it, in my mind, a little bit more delineated, a little more clear.
I think the more we've been talking about TFP studies and even the X factor and ARM more broadly, the more we've been kind of seeing it from the lens of how this is going to be implemented, how any of this is going to be implemented in a rate case. And I think the way we see it is that the TFP study ultimately is just a piece of evidence to assist the petitioner, presumably, who's bringing it forward as part of the rate case and convincing the commission of what the X factor should look like. And I think it's really hard to know personally without ever having looked at a TFP study and having learned everything I know about it from just this docket. It's hard to know which of these is better, but it does feel to me like it also, even if we had a determination based on these definitions, it would depend on the subjective rate case that we're looking at, or more likely the subjective study. I mean, personally, being somewhat of a caveman, I like the idea of the non-parametric one, I also read that, and I've read a lot of Eversource's filings on this, describing it as Ms. Freyer was saying earlier, easier to follow. That sounds attractive, but we wouldn't want to take the position now that that's the preferable study, because again, it's going to depend on the rate case, and it will also depend, frankly, on, we don't know yet what this looks like from our perspective, whether the way these things pan out in a rate case looks more like the way we do cost of capital currently, which is that the utility typically puts on a witness, and then we typically have our own witness who's performed their own cost of capital analysis, or the way we do depreciation currently, which is more like the utility conducts a depreciation study, and we typically have a witness who criticizes or analyzes, to put more in a friendlier tone, that depreciation study, but doesn't necessarily perform their own. It's not clear to us yet which of those options is going to be available to us in future rate cases, particularly because, frankly, I don't know how many people in the country do this stuff. So a classic non-helpful answer maybe, but I think the ultimate answer is we're not ready to say yet which of these makes more sense to us.
If anybody else had any comment?
I might just comment that there's an even simpler approach to calculating an X factor called the Kahn method that has been used in a few proceedings that actually doesn't strictly even require the productivity and input price differentials to be calculated. The basic idea is that in this case, you might say, well, suppose you had the trend in the cost of utilities and took the difference between the cost trend and input price growth and say customer growth, what is the value of X that would make that equal? And I mean, it's something that could also be part of an X factor study, is to do it in the simplest possible way that reduces the penchant for controversy and sort of abstruse issues that the commission doesn't feel that comfortable with. Again, not to say it to the exclusion of another approach, but that it could be added to the approach.
Just to follow up on that, Dr. Lowry, what then is lost in that simplest approach, if anything?
Well, strictly speaking, you don't even have you don't know where the number comes from in terms of what was the industry productivity trend, and what was the inflation differential, or the that's lost because it's just one number. That's why oftentimes can be best to do it both ways, but it can be a useful cross check, and maybe even the number that the commission ultimately is more comfortable with.
Attorney Goodman.
Thank you. Question, if I could go 10 or 20,000 feet above the level of this slide. The question really is directed either both utilities. As we're trying to understand what the TFP is, how it would work, what the different meanings are. One question is, well, I'll continue the analogy to the cost of capital study, and how in a rate case, for example, the utility typically comes with an expert witness who has a somewhat higher range of reasonableness for ROE than, say, a consumer interest or regulatory staff, which typically comes in at a lower range of reasonableness. So clearly there's some opportunity, not that it's outcome oriented, but depending on the selection of methods and inputs, you can end up on, in very different places. So for the total, for the productivity study, how susceptible is it to similar choices of inputs and approaches? I mean, if, for example, the utility, speaking hypothetically, not suggesting that either Eversource or UI would do this, but if the utility wanted the study to come in showing its, I guess, cost or productivity measure, at a certain amount relative to other utilities in the group, because they thought that would give it a better opportunity to potentially earn more under the rate plan, how, is it similarly susceptible to that kind of manipulation, if you will, like the cost of capital study?
I'll start and then invite my colleagues from Eversource to add, because I'm sure they will have things to add. I see it very similarly to how Attorney Wheel laid it out, that as a utility, we would come in with an X factor study where we've made certain choices that we think reflect the circumstance of our utility. For example, maybe we think a smaller proxy group is appropriate as compared to a larger one. Maybe we think it's appropriate to study a shorter period of time because a prevailing wage law was passed recently. That means that older history is not as applicable, but I would see it as incumbent upon us to explain those choices and make those clear. And then I would look forward to discussing those choices with, in light of the OCC's analysis, not criticism, but and any other docket participants. I would envision having to answer discovery about why we included or excluded a certain company, why we chose to implement the Kahn method or the Spock method or anything else that may exist. So that's not directly an answer to your question, but I would see having to make choices in that regard as a key part of the study. I would see the utility explaining itself and then having to answer questions and respond to other participants' positions. And over the course of multiple cases, that might become more refined as we all kind of learn the lay of the land here.
And if I could just chime in on that, partially because we're an hour and 47 minutes in, and this is the longest I've gone in any one of these meetings without speaking, so I feel obliged. But in all seriousness, so I would say a few things, and maybe I'll answer it in a bit of a different way, but I have now been a part of, I think, 6 TFP studies, and I can say if I were under oath, I have not influenced any of the assumptions in that study. I look at this chart and I couldn't weigh in on, I'd have to Google what any of those things mean. They're not something that I don't get involved in the TFP study. It's not my bailiwick. If I could take a step back from all the information that was shared today, the way I have always viewed what that study stands for, and nothing that I've heard today changes it, is at the end of the day, the study is intended to give a cost trend representative of an average industry participant and it's relative to GDPPI, which is a published standard, no one can dispute index. But at the end of the day, the objective of coming out of a rate case with that in hand, the combination of I and X, is so that you can have a way to measure what the average industry participants' cost trend will be over the course of the PBR plan. And I believe what Dr. Lowry and Ms. Freyer were speaking to before is essentially there's complexity there. You can choose a different I, you can choose, and then that will result in a different X. But I think, and they can tell me where I'm wrong, at the end of the day, it's still going to be the same objective. You're still going to have the objective to come out of it with a formulaic way to have rates changing over the course of the PBR term that track with an average industry participant. And that's going to be the objective of a TFP study. So that is not something that I can influence as, a person in Eversource's finance organization. I wouldn't know how to do that. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. And then it's up to the utility to try to live within the envelope of revenues that are provided for in there. I think where we may have influence or insights, because it wouldn't be self-evident in just looking at the FERC Form 1 data, would be on the cost benchmarking study. If that were to say, and that's based on the individual utility, that could indicate to the practitioner that a utility is more or less efficient. Well, we may look at that if you're looking at just like a cost per customer, and it's actually, Attorney Will, we had this conversation in the REO2 docket. You could look at a metric that might on its face say, your cost per customer is higher than the average utility. Well, I may have very good reasons why that's the case, not indicating that I'm not operating efficiently, but because we have a different cost structure. If we have more underground or our customers are spread farther, whatever the case might be, there could be information that I could give that would indicate that it's not that I'm not operating efficiently in the way that I think of efficiency, or I'm not productive in the way that I think of productive, what productivity means, but just in terms of what the science represents. So I say all that to say, again, I guess I agree with Attorney Wheel. It's going to depend on what you're presenting in the rate case, but I think for the purpose of this conversation, I'm looking at it as saying, do we want to be focusing on, I minus X and then have X be negative? Or I think where Dr. Lowry was heading is you could choose something else for I that might not lead you to have a negative X, but would still give the same sort of at least principled approach. You'd have a positive X, so it doesn't give the appearance as if you're not having a productive utility or approving, a rate plan that rewards an unproductive utility, but it still gets to the same place, that you're still getting to a framework that gives the utility a rate trend over the course of the PBR term so that you have the opportunity, but not a guarantee, to earn your authorized ROE, provided that cast-off rates are set based on our cost of service, and that the TFP study, with whatever the inputs and outputs are, giving you that cost trend. And then you have other guardrails in place, whether it's with a cost benchmarking study that factors into the establishment of a stretch factor. You have earning sharing that provides protection if we over-earn, or an off-ramp if we under-earn, and exogenous factors of things that aren't taken into account come into play and need to be accounted for in the formula.
If I can just jump in a little bit on the question as one of the practitioners in the room. I would say that if I had to choose a hat between being an artist versus a scientist, this particular analysis requires a scientist, not an artist, which means that it's really subject to the data and what the numbers in the data really say. We don't come up with a hypothesis and then try to artistically force it into that area. There are no abstract assumptions that we would make, especially with a non-parametric technique, because there is no layer of kind of statistical techniques or weightings that you put in. It's really being driven by just the numbers that you've collected data for. Now, we did mention that there are choices you need to make, and sometimes we've done in other regulatory proceedings, when there's a particular choice that's controversial, and for example, in Ontario, for one of my proceedings, I used a physical method for measuring capital, and it was quite unconventional in North America to use that type of approach, although it's been used in Australia and other places for regulatory purposes. But what we've then done is we've presented both a physical and a monetary approach to show that even that particular choice doesn't actually change the conclusion. Or test whether it changes the conclusion, maybe is a better way to say it. So there are times where we, again, are making certain choices, but you could probably come up with a way to show what the implications of that choice are quantitatively.
All right, Mr. White, next question.
Yeah, thank you. So this question for Eversource. So just sticking with sort of grounding myself in this particular slide, there's a difference between parametric and non-parametric studies. And does the company have a view on these two options? And I'm thinking kind of in terms of like when you were talking about frontier versus non-frontier, simpler versus more complicated, in terms of parametric and non-parametric. Is one simpler than the other, or just generally speaking?
We're looking at each other going, who's going to answer it? I think from a simpler in terms of implementation, the non-parametric technique is simpler by far. I think it's simpler also from being able to digest the implications and understand the methodologies, the parametric techniques. Although it doesn't say both require regression. So ordinary least squares, it's a form of regression. Stochastic frontier modeling requires regression. So it requires knowledge of statistical concepts, which may not be not everyone's bailiwick. So, so it's, I think, simpler from a, and more transparent from a common understanding perspective.
Thank you. So, okay, thank you. Another question for Eversource. In the company's response to UPA 59, Table 1 noted the drawbacks of the index method stating that it, quote, does not allow for identification of various factors of TFP change, such as technical efficiency, scale efficiency, et cetera. Can you explain the significance of technical efficiency and scale efficiency in general terms?
Well, I think, again, we have to step back. Total factor productivity, the definition you had on the slide before, is all about the relationship between physical inputs and physical outputs. And as Dr. Laurie also talked about in his presentation, there's a theoretical underpinning to all of this with respect to what drives cost. And what drives productivity then, cost trends, productivity trends. There could be different drivers that explain what is happening. For example, the industry as a whole may be able to, at certain periods, take more advantage of technological change, or may be able to take advantage of economies of scale to grow, or other factors. When you do a numerical index number method, using the terminology that's on the screen, you will get a measure of total factor productivity, but you won't be able to say, and let's come up with an example. Let's say that the total factor productivity that your study identified is 1% per annum on average. You won't be able to say, well, what portion of that 1% is being driven by technology improvements, or what portion of that 1% is driven by the industry growing in scale and being able to harness economies of scale. That only comes up if you start looking at parametric techniques that then decompose or isolate those drivers. But only if you have data to do that too. So I won't make promises that you'll be always able to decompose it, subject to good quality data to get at that.
I wonder, just to follow up on that, if in the absence of the data or the decomposed drivers of the result of a TFP, something that Mr. Horton said earlier about being able to identify differences for a given utility, or even some discussion we had earlier about the environmental factors of where a utility is operating. Does explaining those types of factors qualitatively, maybe in a narrative accompanying a TFP study, provide any value, or is that just sort of adding speculation to what might be behind the results of index number method?
I think those types of qualitative, although they could also be supported with quantitative evidence, is extremely important to understand the results of a benchmarking study. For a TFP, maybe if we can step back and think a little bit about that, it may be also useful, as Dr. Laurie said, if in a particular industry you would you believe that a sub-industry group like the New England region or the Northeast region is different from, let's say, the Southwest United States, then I think that type of additional evidence could be useful to explain why they may be experiencing different trends in productivity, not different cost per unit of output, but different trends over time. And you might need to have data to establish that. But again, it may be data that goes beyond just the experience of a single utility. It's the experience of the industry or subgroups of that industry that you would be looking at. But maybe one more thing. I know we made the point that you can't decompose the TFP trend, but you don't need to decompose the TFP trend to set the X factor. Just wanted to put that out there too, right? It's not a necessary, it's useful information for a data scientist like myself. I'd love to understand the data, but it's not necessary in order to calibrate an X factor for an I minus X revenue adjustment mechanism.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand that. I think it could be relevant or interesting, useful for any participant, right? To then know, and please correct me if I'm getting out into left field here, but to know then during the period, where might we expect efficiencies to come from? If there were if it were to show that there were some things were driving that efficiency, but other things were not, well, maybe the things that are excluded from driving efficiency could be things where a regulator or a participant might want to dig and say, is that something where we might see over the period some change or some progress, just as a place to start? Okay, thank you.
Another question for Eversource, and this is getting to the more to the rate case process. In your response to UPA 59, you assumed that a skilled and knowledgeable consultant would conduct a TFP study and need 3 to 6 months for it. Sticking with your assumption and understanding that a rate case has 350 days to conclude, how would you envision this timing working with the possibility of alternative analyses? For example, you stated discovery and cross-examination are necessary to vet the study's findings. So if we assume that DACA participants hire skilled and knowledgeable consultants, then based on this proceeding, how long might the discovery and cross-examination take in this docket? And also, should we expect to schedule TFP-related cross-examination at a time or times other than when the rate case cross-exam normally happens?
I mean, I'll start. I think both Ms. Freyer and Dr. Lowry have participated in other proceedings, so can chime in on how it's worked there. I think we're envisioning that if an I-X or a TFP study would be used in a PPR proceeding, it would be filed along with the initial petition, just like, we've compared it to like a depreciation study or an ROE study. So that would be part of the initial application. I mean, we've been involved in other proceedings I have where other parties have come in and either have produced their own analysis or critiqued the analysis that's been provided, and it's been on the same schedule as the rest of the case. It hasn't had to take on a separate track. I don't know all the work that's gone in to enable that to happen, but it's been part of the other proceedings that I've been involved with and hasn't altered the schedule.
Okay.
And just one small further comment on that. In Connecticut, as you, I'm sure know, we have a substantive notice requirement where we're required to file a notice of intent to file a rate case 30 to 60 days in advance, which would allow interveners to start ahead of time if time is of the essence.
Okay. A question for UI. What are the likely challenges that participants should expect with time and resources?
Like from a rate case consultant retention perspective, or?
So I guess what I'm thinking is anybody besides the EDC, what challenges could they expect? Because it is different, slightly different.
So I think, again, to draw an analogy to other rate case studies, we see consultants who frequently analyze the validity of our cost of capital recommendations or depreciation or lead lag recommendations. And I would see this just being another example of those. And to your question, I would foresee a dedicated total factor productivity panel at the hearing, maybe not a separate hearing specifically for that, but just like revenue requirements, we get cross-examined, HR, cost of customer service, you run down the list. I would expect this to be another name on the list, and I would expect the as deemed appropriate and efficient by PURA and others that potentially additional consultants are brought in to assist in that process.
Thank you.
And one other point there, I think Ms. Freyer made the point about the excellent data quality in the United States. The FERC Form 1 data is publicly available. It's filed, it's available for anyone's perusal. So while the utility might have special insight into their own operations, they're not going to have special insight into the operations of every other utility in the US. So I would think, from that perspective, there's no differential.
Okay. Thank you. Question for Eversource. Still with UPA 59, it was stated in any TFP study process to ensure an empirically robust and relevant TFP study, the underlying data and calculations should be made available to all stakeholders. So just to be clear, I'm thinking, is that coming only from the perspective of the EDC? Or if there were others, as an example, if OCC did a TFP study, that everybody's study gets shared among everybody?
Yes.
Okay. And if a participant wanted to conduct their own study, could they expect to access and use the company's data set? Or is that proprietary?
I think that, at least in our experience, when we've provided our studies, we've provided it to parties, all parties in the case. We don't want them to then go and publish our study on the internet, but the point is to provide it in a format that they could use the data, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Could I clarify that customarily, all parties can examine the data and even do their own calculations, but subject to a confidentiality agreement? Oftentimes, the data are actually being rented from a data agency like S&P, and it's like $40,000 a year to get access to that, and it's a 1-year subscription. So their data vendors are very anxious about other parties using the data. In fact, there's one of the 2 data vendors that won't even rent their data in proceedings like this because they're afraid that other parties will get access to it and misuse it.
Thank you. Question for UI. How long does a TFP study remain useful? In other words, would a new TFP study be required in 4 years for a second generation MRP?
I guess I'll take that question. Usually if it's a 4-year lag, it would be warranted to do another study. Again, as much for the input price issues as for the productivity issues. But now we're entering a period when we've been in a world where the RepEx was the big deal, the big source of variation in the productivity growth of power distributors. But we're about to enter a new area when maybe capacity expansions due to beneficial electrification might matter more than in the past. So there would probably be grounds for doing it every 4 years, 4 or 5 years.
Thank you. A question for Eversource. In UPA 67, the company stated that the company has not conducted a TFP study for its Connecticut EDC operations. Has the company conducted a TFP study for its non-EDC operations in Connecticut?
We filed our Yankee rate case and included a TFP study with that last week.
Thank you. Another question for Eversource. So moving on to inputs. With regard to inputs, how would they be introduced to the docket? What are you thinking, via standard filing requirements? And if so, when might such SFRs be established?
When you're using the word inputs, are you talking about quantity of inputs in a TFP study for the industry or something else? I just want to make sure I understood the question.
Sorry, say that one more time.
when you said the word inputs, what are you talking about? Sorry, inputs, as I defined it, inputs that are measured as part of an industry TFP study, or?
Yeah, let me back off. Let me back off on that for a second, because the inputs, if I heard you correctly before, the study is completely done before the filing is made. So it would include all the inputs and the outputs.
For the, yes, and not just for the company, for the industry.
Yeah, okay, okay.
So maybe just to follow up and confirm then, it would be, what would be filed would be sort of a self-contained package that if it's an Excel workbook, as you had described before, that would have all of the information needed in terms of inputs, the analysis that's conducted, the outputs, within that single workbook. Is that accurate?
That is, and we like to work in Excel because we find it is most accessible to staff, to parties. The consultants may use other formats to produce it, but yes, the idea is it's a set of work papers that represent all the data that went in and show how the data was ultimately used to make the calculations.
And is the Excel file, it may not be for every case necessarily, but is it typically linked in live so that any participant can go and sort of trace through the steps in the process?
I think it depends on each jurisdiction and that what is afforded in terms of protective order, because the calculations and the links are commercially sensitive, so we don't want it going out publicly. If the PO provides it, I don't see why there wouldn't be a concern to provide all live links. But it does vary from, in my experience, from one jurisdiction to the other a little bit.
Understood. Anything to add on that, Dr. Lowry? Or
Personally, I really don't like spreadsheets. They're very inefficient when you're trying to do multiple runs, but there's always, it's sort of driven by the lowest common denominator intervener that wants to see understand what was done. And so, I mean, the alternative is code. And I kind of wish, if wishes were fishes, that the experts would agree to use a certain code like R or something like that instead of spreadsheets. But it is, as Ms. Fryer says, become pretty common now.
thank you.
So a question for UI. Could you provide an overview of the potential biases from the various assumptions?
I'll have to echo Mr. Horton. I hardly even know what half the words on the screen mean, so it'd be really tough for me to bias the results. Maybe give me a little more there. I could give a little more informed answer, but I don't envision us attempting to put our thumbs on the scales or distort or manipulate or any of the other words that have been used today. We're just trying to get it right, and we hire experts to get it right.
Yeah, so I guess I wasn't even really thinking of that. I was thinking, and I'm no expert in TFP studies, but my understanding is something like the depreciation that gets used in it. Different companies have different composite depreciation, right? So something along those lines. What are the potential biases from those assumptions that I think I'm thinking would be made in any sort of study like that?
Maybe I'll offer some sort of higher level commentary and then invite others to add as they see fit. But I think going back to something Mr. Horton said a while ago, none of this changes the overall goal of PBR. We're trying to set rates that reflect the utilities costs, that provide a reasonable opportunity, but not a guarantee of earning a fair rate of return on and of invested capital. And so to that end, nothing should bias the calculation because there is no altering that statutory requirement or constitutional requirement. But are there considerations that must be involved in the PBR study? Absolutely. The climate, the level of forest cover, how old the system is, how potentially the depreciation rates, I'm not sure how that interacts with the TFP study specifically, but obviously that is an important part of the RAM overall. So I think there are a wide variety of considerations that I would expect to be involved in the study, and I would expect to employ experts like we have here today to help us get educated on some of those particulars. So that's not a very crisp answer to your question, but hopefully that helps for where we're coming from, and others may have more to add.
With regard to the depreciation rate, specifically, actually in the TFA study, the issue was the decay rate of the capital quantity. That is actually not a big deal. It's a same assumption for all utilities. The witness does have to defend the results, the assumptions that were made, but its results tend not to be sensitive to that particular item. There are some other issues that the results are more sensitive to. In a few proceedings, the average service life was an issue when practitioners used the one-Haché approach to capital quantity. There are other issues that'll come up. You'll often see a big issue right at the moment, like, did you include California utilities or not? Because California utilities are like the biggest in the country, and they've had these wildfire problems. So did your witness include those or not? But by and large, a lot of the issues are an awfully large number of the issues don't matter that much. There are occasionally a few hotter button issues.
Thank you.
One just follow up then on the idea of some of those considerations or the different choices that you have as you're conducting the study. I think back, Ms. Freire, to an example you gave where when you choose one alternative, you might show the other for comparison so that it can be clear what the differences are. And I think that, as this is something that's being considered for the first time potentially in Connecticut, the extent to which, I guess let me ask it as a question, is there a roadmap of sorts that lists out the different design choices or considerations through the process of the study so that participants can understand if they're looking through the results of a study, okay, the company or their consultant made this choice, they did not make this other choice, and therefore the results might be influenced in that way. Right? I think it's another way to ask Mr. White's question, which is there are different ways that the study can be conducted, and how can staff and participants understand the extent to which those choices are influencing the results of the study?
So if I remember correctly, because it has been a little bit of time, I apologize, my mic wasn't off, but the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories paper that this excerpt comes from that we are looking at the screen did actually sort of do that. I recall it wasn't maybe all on one page in one graphic, but I think the way they linearly discussed, the step by step what had to be considered, what options were available for consideration, they sort of laid that out.
Great.
And the only thing I would caution is there are sometimes reasonable choices, multiple choices you could make. And I gave the example earlier, if the data allows, you could do a physical capital approach rather than a monetary capital approach. And then I think it is important to maybe look at them side by side, but you wouldn't want to create this impression that, let me give you an example, that a 20-year service life would make sense for electric distribution utilities when all the depreciation studies reviewed point to, and I'm just making this up, 50 years, right? The choices have to be reasonable on both ends to be then subject to comparison. So just a caution, because sometimes we get a little bit beyond ourselves and want to test everything when it doesn't make sense to test everything that falls outside of that range of reasonableness.
Thank you.
Could I also make the comment that one way to reduce concern about this is, first of all, when you commission the study or you invite studies, that you put in the language that due attention be paid to sensitivity analysis in the original report. And then secondly, make it clear one way or the other that requests for sensitivity analysis are expected to be honored by when other parties ask for them within reason.
Thank you.
A question for Eversource. Just generally speaking, when we're talking about the different approaches, is it with regard to finding opportunities for efficiency gains within an EDC, is there much of anything to be found in the non-frontier, non-parametric, the simplest of the studies? Because it sounds to me, what I've been hearing today is there's more potential with the more complex studies, the frontier or the parametric. Would there be much of any opportunity for efficiency gains typically found in the non-frontier, non-parametric? Because we wouldn't have that level of detail.
I think maybe if I could start
Sure.
and then the experts can chime in. I think this is, previously a question was asked, what are the challenges that stakeholders would face? And to me, we're kind of touching upon that because what the study tells us isn't what you're thinking it is. It's not like when we just did this for Yankee Gas, it isn't like LEI came in and said, oh, here are all these places where you're going to find efficiencies over the next 4 years. Here are all the places where you're operating inefficiently or not being productive. That's not what this is. So what we're looking at is decisions that are made or how analysis can be done to inform a TFP, the I minus X. It doesn't tell you where the company's going to find efficiencies or where it's inefficient. That's just not what it does.
Thank you.
But just to understand then a point that Ms. Freyer's made before about decomposing in some of the more advanced methods, those can, when the data is available, lead to identifying drivers of efficiency for a given is it for the utility or for the industry? Industry. Okay, thank you. So in that case, that helps connect the dot that you're putting out there, Mr. Horton, that it's not then going to identify, okay, this utility has been more efficient in this way. And so then there are other ways that it has been less efficient that could be ripe for further focus.
Doesn't do that at all. And that's why I keep saying, we're going to come out, if this is done, you're going to get cast off rates that reflect the going in cost of service that gives that utility that opportunity to, and then you're going to have rate trajectory over the course that however you come up with stochastic and parametric and all these things that I was about to say until Dr. Lowry said it. The one thing I learned was one-Haché versus geometric decay, which one-Haché I learned, and it may be wrong, is like a single horse-drawn carriage. It works until it dies. As opposed to geometric decay, it kind of slowly degrades over time. So it's a measure of decay that goes into the TFP study, which has nothing to do with how we account for depreciation. It's got nothing to do with the depreciation study in the way that I think of it. I'm not an accountant, but the way that it impacts the cost of service. I say all that to say, at the end of the day, it's supposed to come up with a trend in rates, and then the utility is supposed to be trusted to go and find ways to operate more efficiently. It doesn't come in and tell you this is where you're operating inefficiently and therefore need to do better, or your cost of service is going to be set lower. It's completely separate.
Thank you. So a question for Eversource. Ms. Fryer, you were talking about, in your slides, you were talking about the outputs. I forget exactly what it was, typical outputs. I think you said customers, maybe peak demand. If we were talking about, I guess it'd probably be either energy or demand. Are those outputs, generally speaking, based on net of certain factors? I'm thinking in terms of efficiency or behind the meter. And is there more to the story? Is there more to the story that is material in nature with regard to factors like that?
So when we have used sales or the megawatt hours over the course of the year delivered on the distribution system, we've again sourced it from data repositories like the Energy Information Administration or the FERC Form 1 that ensures consistency how it's measured by every single utility. I believe that it is measured without any weather normalization. So what it was actually metered sales, and it is measured, if you will, to already incorporate anything and everything that may be reducing or increasing those sales. So in some utilities, maybe there is electric vehicle policies, and that may be different than in another service territory or another state. Or on the flip side, energy efficiency programs that may be impacting those sales. So, but that is the important thing is that it's measured consistently across all utilities in the industry, so that you can aggregate, sum it up without incurring any flaws in that logic. That you're summing up apples to apples, not apples and oranges. If you decide to do a benchmarking study, for example, that then tries to see how external factors like EV policies or energy efficiency programs may be affecting relative costs of one utility versus another, as long as you have a way to effectively measure the existence of those policies with data, you can in statistical based benchmarking studies account for that.
Okay, thank you. So with regard to, staying with Eversource right now, with regard to multiple outputs, can the TFP study provide all the multiple outputs? And I'm also wondering about perhaps like a blended rate for the outputs.
So under an index number method approach, you can, subject to data being available, record and measure, basically create an output index that is itself composed of multiple measures of output. But in order to create a single index, when you're starting maybe with 2 or more in sub-indices, you have to make a decision, a choice again, on how you weight those different outputs. And the technically correct way to do that is to do revenue shares, but it itself requires an additional analysis, an econometric analysis, to determine the appropriate revenue shares.
I'm curious how you do it, still to Eversource. Your output, if output is energy or power, would you typically recommend measuring it in supply or demand?
We would measure it based on how the distribution utilities report it to FERC on FERC Form 1.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, for purposes of consistency.
So that's different across the industry then. Some do it, they may do it either way, you're not sure?
I think it's consistent everywhere across the US industry, at least. It's basically the megawatt hour served. FERC Form 1 requires in its nature consistency in reporting from all states and all utilities under its jurisdiction.
Okay, okay. Still with Eversource, just following up here, would different outputs result in different X factors potentially?
I think that's an empirical question. So I think you can't rule out that different outputs would not cause different trends in productivity over time.
So I should have rephrased. I should have used the word could, not would. Got it. It could.
It could.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And maybe another word of caution, when you do a TFP study, again, you may want to think broadly, and you think about things like, what is my output, my proxy for the physical outputs that utilities provide? You may want to go back and think about the the broader PBR framework you're applying? Do you have a revenue cap or a price cap? Do you have other features which may make a certain output a better proxy to fit in within the framework? Because again, the ultimate objective or purpose of the TFP is to inform the X factor that would go into an I minus X that is then applied in the construct of a price cap or a revenue cap or broader PBR framework. And you want it to be internally consistent then.
Thank you. And a follow-up to Eversource, because I think you had spoken to this before, Mr. Ortman, but just to be clear about it, is there any way that a TFP study could be leveraged to benefit ratepayers in future periods? I mean, there's a lot of information there.
Well, I mean, I think in my mind, the whole purpose of a rate case and the PBR plan is to benefit ratepayers, for sure. It depends on what you mean by benefit ratepayers. A TFP study is supposed to give you the average, at least the way that I understand it and explain it is it gives you the cost trend of an average industry participant. So if it's applied in that formulaic way and developed based on the way the science suggests, then it's incentivizing the utility to operate more efficiently than the average industry participant, wringing out all cost savings that it can during the course of the PBR term, and that benefits customers. Its intent is not, if you're asking, can it benefit ratepayers by giving information on, an inefficient utility where it can become more efficient? That's not the purpose of the study. So it's just not going to give you that. And that's what I understood your question to be asking before. It's just that's not what it's designed to do, and that's not what it does.
All right, thank you.
And if I could just add briefly, I don't mean to relitigate UI's last rate case or the upcoming one, but I think ratepayers benefit from just and reasonable rates. And a TFP study or an X factor study is part of making sure that happens. So I just want to make clear that if rates are too high or too low, ratepayers do not benefit in UI's view. And a TFP study is part of ensuring that does not happen as a result of the any rates established pursuant to this PBR framework.
And but that's when we've, been consistent on this from the start, that we've got these 3 dockets, these 3 reopeners, but all the components need to work together. Every element of REO1, we're talking about the TFP and the X factor here, but there's a number of other things. We've mentioned this, broken records here. Same with REO2, the metrics come in to say, when you've given the trust to the utility to go off and operate under the PBR plan, here are the metrics that we want to be holding them accountable to. And then REO3 with the integrated system plan, that's where presumably there would be discussion and review of all the factors that go into the utilities capital planning process over the planning horizon. So in my mind, these things all need to work together with the ultimate objective to be what, Jacob and I keep saying, to have an opportunity to earn our authorized ROE and pursue all those investments over the course of the plan and improve service in all the areas that are going to be isolated in REO2, et cetera. And then the utility will have the revenues to run the business, make the investments in people, processes, and technology, and serve our customers, and do so at a lower cost than we otherwise would under alternative forms of rate making.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I think we're almost done with the questions that we had on the TFP study before we move on to benchmarking. I guess just one thing I wanted to come back to on the TFP study is, I think there's a lot that's being put out in terms of educating participants here, obviously, in what this is, how it's conducted. I'm wondering if Ms. Freyer or you, Dr. Lowry, have any observations or best practices from other jurisdictions where they use total factor productivity study in terms of how the type of education and experience that we are going through in this docket, how that can then transfer to a rate case when a TFP study is filed as a part of a rate application, so that any party who is participating can can plug in and can understand what they're looking at and how to make sense of it, not having necessarily the benefit of going through this proceeding where we're taking a closer look at things. Any best practices you can share from other jurisdictions on how they help other participants come up the curve and engage on this topic?
I have in other jurisdictions gone through, in addition to, I guess I would call it formal discovery after the application's been filed with the study, to go through like a tech workshop conference. And I think that allows for more kind of quicker response to questions than just the back and forth writing. So we've definitely done that. And it's been useful because it gives you an opportunity to explain the results that somebody reading it on the page may not fully appreciate. So it doesn't even require participants to have gone in and spent hours studying those work papers. I mentioned the Excel files and so forth. It's just another opportunity to really get somebody grounded in all the work. So I would recommend that if that is available as an option in Connecticut. I don't know the particulars in terms of how rate cases proceed, but I think those are useful.
Thank you.
I would say that, sorry, the good evidence is obviously helpful. Evidence that explains thoroughly the methodology, the reasoning underlying the methodology, maybe also getting into some of the history of X factor regulation, noting X factor precedents in other jurisdictions. It can help to have multiple approaches using, as I already suggested, if you expect them to have a few sensitivity analysis, they will provide that. And then you get to learn from that experience. And I also already mentioned the possibility of the Kahn method, which is the simplest method. And anyone can understand that. And then it will be a useful point of comparison to results that are used, result from the favored method, although the Kahn method could be the favored method of the witness. By the way, the name for that comes from Alfred Kahn, the famous regulatory economist who was a professor at Cornell. And he invented that method for use in interstate oil pipeline proceedings. And it's still used with, it's evolved a little bit over time, but it's still used to this day by in interstate oil pipeline regulation.
Could you spell Kahn?
K-A-H-N.
K-A-H-N, thank you.
I guess I'm showing my age that I know about him and.
Just for the record, thank you. Okay, I think unless other participants have questions for one another to round out this conversation, I think we can move on to the benchmarking study. Attorney Lau.
Actually, Tom Wheel from OCC again. I just had a comment on your last question, which is that I think this stuff obviously is really complex and we feel intimidated by it. And again, it doesn't seem like there are a lot of people across the country who understand this stuff, but that should, from my perspective at least, make this more difficult for utilities as opposed to the other way around, because the utilities' job as petitioners in rate cases is to persuade the commission that their perspective is the right one and that their outcome, the outcome they're seeking, is the appropriate outcome. And if this stuff isn't understandable or palatable, and if the commission and stakeholders aren't able to understand it, then I think it's within PURA's discretion to, just like any fact finder, to say this is impenetrable. This doesn't make any sense to me. We're not going to accept this. So I just wanted to add that, not as sort of an aggressive comment to make towards the utilities, but sort of to emphasize that that's sort of baked into the regulatory process and part of why, despite our concerns for the complexity and our lack of internal expertise in this area, it is part of what makes it potentially should balance the scales a little bit, in that, again, it's sort of an uphill battle, I think, to propose a really complex, difficult to explain theory to a fact finder. That's it.
Thank you. Attorney Goodman.
Thank you. I'll be brief with a comment and a question. The comment, going back to the possibility, if not likelihood, that some of the data embedded in the TFP study would be proprietary or confidential. Understanding there could be an NDA, it seems also similar to like a cost service study where parties can access something that includes confidential material. But I think that if Pura were to reconsider and decide to utilize TFP studies as part of its PBR framework, then I think that should include a requirement that the TFP study that's filed will be accessible to all parties, even if subject to an NDA. There shouldn't be a piece of it that is held back based on data vendor proprietary concerns, because that just enables a level of transparency for a very complex study that I think would be inappropriate. That's the comment. The question is, if I can ask at least Mr. Lowry and Ms. Freyer, if she'd like to weigh in. We've heard the possibility of sensitivity analyses with it. I'm just curious to hear from the experts' opinions what the top 1 or 2 or 3 sensitivity analyses they think would be most relevant year in, year out might be.
And while we do, I can just offer a couple, comments in reaction to your question and Attorney Wheel, your commentary. I think one thing that Avangrid has seen work really effectively in other jurisdictions is after an affiliate will submit a rate case, sometimes there will be a walkthrough of particularly complicated Excel models that were submitted as part of that case with commission staff or in Maine, it's called the OPA, the public advocate. As Ms. Freyer alluded to, it's easy to see something like that making sense here, given the anticipated complexity of the study. And I also will just throw in that, Mr. Kramer, I really liked a suggestion you made or implied earlier in this technical conference that maybe there's some sort of roadmap of considerations. And I think, Mr. Goodman, this is kind of what your question is getting at too, of, yeah, we'll learn more about these studies as we do more, as we iterate, as we go through PBR. But for the first one, here's, some guidance as to these are the 3, 4, 5 things, however many that we expect to be thought through. Not that we have to be overly prescriptive before we've done a study, but these are some of the questions we've had, and then leave it up to the experts to explain how they get addressed.
After giving the matter a little thought, I would say that the 3 most important areas where sensitivity analysis would be warranted would be the capital cost specification, the sample period, and the peer group. A national peer group almost always is appropriate, but then a regional peer group, for example, or whatever other peer group that the consultant deems advisable. I mean, I would say here in New England that you'd want to have a regional peer group no matter what, and then maybe even a question of any more custom peer group. With regard to the capital cost specification, it wasn't long ago that was a big issue in these studies, but that has subsided with as the consultants have tended to converge in their productivity estimates.
On that vein, I would say that because it's really simple or relatively simple, I also suggest looking at different output metrics. Again, megawatt hours and customer numbers are easily available, so it's not a huge effort to collate both and do the analysis with either one of them and present side by side. And there may be reasons, depending on the time frame chosen, where you might have to eliminate one, but it gives you the data and then the rationale to eliminate one. The megawatt hours tends to be a lot more volatile, and if the starting or endpoints of the TFP study overlap with a particular, for the industry, a particular set of conditions where it spiked, was anomalous, it could bias the results, bias from a statistical or quantitative perspective. And so you would then not want to put weight on that. But to be able to see it side by side and go through that logic is probably useful. though I don't expect it to be tremendously different in terms of its outcomes for electric distribution.
All right, thank you. Let's move on now to discussing the benchmarking study in just a little more detail. Up on the screen, we've got the description from the PNNL report describing the benchmarking study as supporting an S factor, also known as a customer dividend. And the note here about reflecting the specific nature of a given utility and the efficient costs of providing electricity for that business. The straw proposal merely said that the S factor and benchmarking study were to be further investigated, and you can see the venues in which some discovery has been conducted to date. And so with that, Mr. White, I'll turn it over to you for some questions on the benchmarking study.
Thank you. So the first question, I'll go to Eversource, and keeping in mind that I realize some of this may very well be the same as the TFP study, but I just want this on the record. With regard to inputs, to be clear on the benchmarking study, would it simply be introduced at the outset of the rate case?
I was going to suggest potentially, I think it depends on.
Okay.
There are other ways, perhaps that an S factor is informed. I believe it was Dr. Laurie or maybe Mr. Hurwitz. One of you guys mentioned earlier that there might be implicit S factors simply because of the choice of PBR model. For example, inclusion or exclusion of that growth factor. So there may be other ways to support or inform an S factor, and maybe a benchmarking study is not needed in that regard. But to the extent that it's deemed necessary, I think it could be done. It's usually done sequentially because it uses data that's already in the TFP, at least from a practitioner's perspective, but it could be done ahead of preparing all the materials.
Thank you. So I'm wondering, you said having it potentially done sequentially. I'm wondering about baking it into the 350-day window for a rate case and how that would work.
I don't see any issue with that. That's
Okay.
where we've had to do it. We've submitted both the TFP and the benchmarking study at the same time.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
I almost draw an analogy to like you do a revenue requirement study and then a rate design study to conduct rates, but you submit both with a rate case filing. That's kind of how I'm drawing the analogy in my head, if that helps.
Yeah. Thank you.
While you're considering that next question, just Ms. Ferreira, I may have misunderstood, but I think I heard you say that if it was deemed necessary to do the benchmarking study, and if a benchmarking study wasn't conducted, but a TFP study was, you would essentially be left with an X factor that shows the efficiency or adjusts the economy-wide inflation measure for the industry, but then not specifically for the utility. So it would seem that you would have a revenue cap formula that could apply to any utility that was included in the TFP study if it were not then adjusted for a specific utility. Is that logic flawed, or do you see where I'm going with the need to adjust further to the specific utility who's making a rate application?
I think I don't want to use the word the logic is flawed, but I think I understand your question. I do want to maybe try to answer it. And I'm going to answer it in a way that's very technical, so I'm trying to figure out how to do this. The TFP study is going to give you trends over time. The benchmarking study does not give you really any trends over time. It gives you a comparative look at costs between one firm or another So it doesn't necessarily right away give you a percentage that becomes the S factor. It doesn't do that. It gives you some information that you could maybe use to then think about, well, what level of S factor do we need in the formula? But it's not that immediate, the immediate output of it comes out and it shows you what level of stretch you want to put on it. I think there is other elements that go into that decision. And in fact, maybe other factors beyond just the empirical analysis using historical data that may determine the S factor or may lead to a determination of the S factor. Maybe another way to also think about it, let's say that you have, and this is the model that's used in Ontario, so that's where I'm giving you an example, where they do benchmarking and they also have a TFP study. So the TFP study is used to set the I-X. They have a stretch factor consumer dividend. How do they use their benchmarking study? They look at all their electric distribution utilities, and they have very many in their jurisdiction with varying sizes. And they basically put the utilities into, I believe, quartiles, maybe quintiles, but I think last time it was quartiles. And they say, well, the group that's kind of in the middle, the two groups in the middle, they don't deserve any stretch factor. They don't get any. It's zero. So the best performers get zero. And then they kind of move off from there and say, well, if you show that you're not in the top, you're one below, you get a little bit of a stretch factor. And then if you're further below, you'll get a bigger stretch factor. So they've come up with a methodology, but it goes beyond just what the benchmarking study says to try to incorporate that methodology. I don't know if that made sense, because I think there's no need from the economic theory to try to quote unquote, if you use the words customize to a specific utility, the formula. The formula is supposed to drive towards the industry productivity levels and allow for remuneration for inflationary pressures that the utility has no external ability to influence. So the X and the I are intentionally not specific to any utility.
Understood. And then I guess my question is, how, if not through a benchmarking study, how would further adjustment, and I'm only pushing on this because I think I heard you say that if it was deemed necessary, so it sounds optional. And so my question is, how could it, if it's not deemed necessary, how would a regulator choose to reflect the specific circumstances of a given utility who's making a rate application separate from the I-X formula?
Well, the going in rates will be specific to each utility. And the I-X formula is just a growth rate that is applied to the going in rates. And depending on the format of the, and to the extent one exists for incremental capital funding, the K-bar, that will also generally be specific to each utility.
That's all I was going to say too. I think, this is going to require PURA to adopt the framework that allows the utility, again, to have the trust between rate cases and gives rate increases between rate cases. And that rate increase is determined by the TFP, but it's just saying for an average industry participant, what is the average rate change needed over the course of the PBR term? So the stretch factor becomes unnecessary if you believe that that's sufficient enough motivation for the utility to operate efficiently during the PBR plan. If we give the utility the cost trend increases applied, based on the going in rates, which are certainly going to be utility specific, then the cost change over time is where the TFP comes in, and that's the biggest factor. The other guardrails, you could say, the S factor is a way to have customers sharing in real time with efficiencies that are experienced. So it can be informed by a cost benchmarking study. But again, no cost benchmarking study that I've seen gives you a dollar amount or a basis point. It just gives you information. But there could be very valid reasons why that information says you should or shouldn't have an additional S factor on top of the X factor. I mean, at the end of the day, all that's going to happen if we get this wrong is utility's not going to be able to stay out of a rate case. And in fact, I go back, I wasn't there, but Dr. Lowry mentioned Massachusetts. My first experience in Massachusetts was in 2017 in the 1705 rate case. There were PBR plans back in the early 2000s, late 1990s that relied on TFP studies where the department altered the results of those studies, is my understanding and recollection, such that the utility wasn't able to uphold its stay out provision and had to file a rate case sooner than what the original intent of the plan was designed to do. And that's all that's going to happen here if we get it wrong for whatever reason, even with good intentions. If it's not giving proper revenue support, the utility won't be able to provide the service it needs to and stay out of a rate case, and it will have to file a rate case sooner. Whether that's because someone comes along and says the X factor is, it's negative, the utility's saying it's negative. I don't think it should be negative. I think it should be positive. PURA decides it's positive, it gives the utility less revenues. Sorry, we can't stay out of a rate case. It's just, whatever, or you say there should be an S factor of 500 basis points so that customers get the savings in real time, or you set the going in rates below what our cost of service is. Any one of these things can break the incentive properties of PBR. They're all interlinked and they're all important. But I think at the end of the day, they have to have that main objective that we keep saying. And the TFP is the main thing that does that.
Thank you. And I think, Ms. Ferrer, I think you answered the question for me of how do we get to the specific utility circumstances through an answer through the going in rates through potentially a K-bar adjustment. And I think the other part of the answer is that the S factor, a benchmarking study, provide information, provide a qualitative, additional data points to be considered as to whether further adjustment specific to the utility, again, the heart of my question, is necessary. So thank you for that. Dr. Lowry, is there anything you want to add to this discussion, or are you? Okay, thank you. Attorney Whale.
I have something just to add, just maybe from like a broader rate making perspective, which is, and we talked about this at a tech conference in this docket a while back, that I think you could, like if the commission had, I keep calling you the commission because I was just at NASUCA and NARUC, where if the authority had specific concerns, like imagine there was a huge contract that we all knew was escalating at a vastly different rate than whatever the ARM dictated. I think you could excise that contract from the going in rates that are subject to the ARM and escalate that however you wanted. So I just use that as an example to say, like, I think there are other, if the authority has specific concerns that the particular utility faces subjective costs that aren't going to be captured in the ARM, there are other ways potentially to address that. But again, not to repeat myself, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, I imagine. Like it's going to depend on what's on the record in the particular rate case.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question to UI, probably to Dr. Lowry. Previously, I believe you were speaking in relation to the TFP study, and you gave a few bullet points on likely considerations that could have the most impact on the outputs of the TFP study. You mentioned I think capital cost, specification, peer group. I'm wondering if you could apply this same question to a benchmarking study. Are there particular considerations that participants should look at in particular?
That's kind of a complicated question, and I could give that a lot of thought, but I guess we don't have time for that. So I'll give you a couple of quick ones. I mean, the big issues with benchmarking are, first of all, there's sort of steps of sophistication that can be used. In Massachusetts, sometimes they use simple unit cost comparisons. The next step towards greater accuracy would be to make those unit cost indexes into productivity indexes that control for differences in the input prices that utilities pay. And then the third step in sophistication would be to go to these econometric studies. The term parametric study was used earlier in the context of TFP because these models have parameters that are estimated econometrically, so therefore a parametric study. So those are the three those are the three biggest steps. And the issue for Pura would be, which would be, how sophisticated you want to get in terms of the studies. One thing I will say about benchmarking in general that you must bear in mind when it comes to gas or power utilities is that there are certain key variables for which there is not very good data, unfortunately. Ironically or otherwise, the data is actually better for gas utilities in some respects than it is for the electric utilities, because for the gas utilities, you know the age of their system, and you also know the extent to which they have cast iron and unprotected bare steel mains. There is no such analogous information in available for electric utilities in the United States right now. One other thing I might mention of important threshold issue, I'm long time believer that you shouldn't look at cost benchmarking distinct from reliability benchmarking. They two really should be jointly considered. I mean, a stretch factor should not solely be based on cost performance. You should also look at the company's reliability, because good reliability does come at a price. So a real state-of-the-art study, whether it uses unit cost or productivity metrics or uses econometrics, would also include a peer group benchmarking study, and the data for that is now available from the Energy Information Administration. There's reasonably abundant data using the IEEE standardized method for reliability.
Thank you.
I listened to what Dr. Laurie said. I agree with his description of the methods. I think in terms of, I think as you move to more sophisticated methods, the choice of peer groups becomes less contentious, I think, because the parameters you add to the statistics control for that in some ways. But you need more data. You need more and more data, the more sophisticated the method you go, and that's kind of a trade-off. I think hopefully that answers your question, Mr. White.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Follow-up for you, Ms. Freyer. Dr. Light had mentioned the econometric benchmarking study. If I recall correctly, that's what was suggested by OCC in the written comments a while ago in May. I'm wondering, you've mentioned how the TFP and benchmarking study generally are sequential. Is a non-parametric TFP study and a parametric benchmarking study, are they compatible? Or do you need to start with maybe a different data set for the TFP study?
They are, I still think, compatible in that you can do them.
Okay.
But once you get, we'll start with a non-parametric TFP study, and it will give you information on physical inputs and physical outputs. Once you move to a parametric, statistical econometric benchmarking, you'll need even more data. That's the point, that you'll need to go gather more information that matches the inputs and outputs you've already used for the TFP study.
Okay, thank you. A question for Eversource. It seems to me that a benchmarking study can contain a variety of useful information. Are you aware of any sort of precedent where benchmarking studies have been expanded beyond the S factor, trying to get to an S factor where it was because there was an understanding that adding this little piece of information would just be extremely valuable? So not necessarily confining it to the bounds of an S factor, determining it, but because you're engaged in that endeavor, it made sense to add something else. Does the question make sense?
I can give you an example. I'm not sure it will apply here in Connecticut, but I can give you an example where benchmarking studies have been used quite a bit in, for example, in the UK, to look at multidimensionally with cost and reliability and other factors to look at decisions being made about the not just going in rates, because they don't use an I-X formula, but they use a forecast method, building block method. So they use benchmarking tools to calibrate those forecasts. But that is an example of where it's a benchmarking study, and usually a very complicated or sophisticated benchmarking study to get you there.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't want to say anything derogatory towards the science of it here. I think in my experience, it's been, because I think, I tend to think of a benchmarking study as in, like, we just got our management audit draft a couple weeks ago. And a lot of the management auditors' focus was on, it would be interesting if you could benchmark this against your peers, key performance indicators. That to me, I think, is helpful information that I would like to have as a manager to know, I don't know, how do I stack up against other utilities in terms of the number of employees on my team, or I don't know what the right data would be. But I think that's useful for me as someone managing a utility, or at least one small piece of it. That's not what I have seen from benchmarking studies like we're talking about here. And that's, I kind of get back to, again, it's useful, it's helpful in the PBR world, but it has limited application in terms of what are we going to actually do with it? How is it going to inform decision-making as a utility manager? Doesn't do that. In fact, it leads to a lot more questions in my mind of, well, if it says we're less efficient, why? And I think the data just on its own doesn't, you've got to basically go and then look at every single utility in the sample and figure out what could be driving it, and you can get anecdotal. It's helpful, it's good, it's not that it's bad information, but it's limited in what it provides. It's limited in terms of those sorts of things where it would be good to know, how do you stack up in certain areas against other utilities, and are there good reasons why? Maybe my team's bigger than others because there's more regulatory activity in the Northeast. I don't know. I mean, I think that's the sort of thing, again, there's a disconnect, I think, in some of the terminology that we use in the PBR world, in what it means to other people who aren't in the PBR world. Inputs and outputs, you lose people. And like, we're even here talking about, when you're asking about inputs and outputs for the TFP study, that means one thing, but I think you might've been asking about like the output of the study. Anyways, so it has limited applicability, I think, when we're actually talking about what are we gonna do with this in the real world, and what is it gonna mean in terms of our ability to serve our customers and stay out of a rate case. If you turn all these dials to try to come up with lower rates, it's going to cause the thing to break. So that's just a word of caution as we proceed.
Thank you.
I'll just add, I think you can see what Mr. Horton said reflected in UI's response to UPA 66, where we said, no, we haven't done a benchmarking study, as that term is used in the context of PBR, but we provided like 6 pages of benchmarking type stuff that the company does. And that's barely scratching the surface of all the different, day-to-day type benchmarking that's done between, the Connecticut affiliates and other affiliates of Avangrid, other entities, other, non-utility entities to the extent applicable. So benchmarking is very, very broad and something we do very, very regularly, but distinct somewhat from this purpose. So I just wanted to plug our hopefully thoughtful response to UPA 66.
If I may make one comment about this, one of the reasons that the benchmarking studies in Massachusetts have not been particularly useful is that they focus on total cost. There's no reason that once you're up and going with a total cost study, you can certainly decompose that at least into O&M expenses versus capital cost and possibly even into more categories. In Ontario, the benchmarking studies routinely decompose and provide results for O&M and capital separately, as well as for total cost. So that's a start down the road of figuring out how they could be made more useful.
Thank you.
I think this is maybe a continuation of that topic. Is there, recognizing that there's a lot of different purposes for benchmarking and that that happens for cost of capital, that happens for looking at compensation studies that also get filed in a rate case. There's a lot of different benchmarking opportunities. Is there any sense in having a consistent set of peers across all of those studies, or is it the case that they have such different purposes that you would make different choices in each one of them? Or is there some efficiency to have to be able to look across the different topics and say it's the same peer group in all of these cases?
If I can jump in as a practitioner, the data may not allow you to have the same peer group because you may be looking at something in a KPI study, key performance indicators for a particular purpose that you just can't readily get data for, let's say, some other form of benchmarking study you're doing at a much higher level, like looking at just total cost or total O&M per customer. So I think data sometimes will restrict you.
And I'll just add, I don't see it as useful to have the same peer group in every instance because I think a lot of those studies you're mentioning serve very different purposes. So cost of capital, is intended to measure, who are we competing with for capital and what's their cost of capital, among other things established by Hope and Bluefield. But that's very different from, who we might be competing for FTEs for and who we have to benchmark the appropriate, salary and benefit package. And you run down the list of other, types of benchmarking. Maybe you benchmark reliability and you want to focus on states that are more forested versus less, just to pick an example. So I think it strikes me there's good substantive reason to have different selections of peers in different contexts.
Thank you. Okay. I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we had prepared and that had come up so far. So unless there's other discussion points or questions rather that participants had to ask of one another on this topic, I'll just allow a moment in case Attorney Wheel, Attorney Goodman, and either of the company. Attorney Goodman, please.
For benchmarking study, how many companies do you need for a statistically significant result?
Well, the first flavor, that's unit cost based, is not statistical. It's non-parametric, which means you can't actually measure statistical confidence. And it could be done on whatever peer group that you need to do it on or justify. So I think it depends.
Okay. Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our agenda for today. And I want to thank all of the participants, the representatives here at the table for joining us and for the discussion. And a plug to please stay tuned to the docket for additional discovery updates there. And a note also that our next technical meeting for this docket 210515 REO1 is scheduled for, I believe it's Monday, December 9th. And so we'll look forward to seeing folks back then. And Commissioner Chairman, that's all that we had.
Great. I'll echo Mr. Kramer's thanks to our presenters and participants, and we are adjourned. Thank you.